Hello friend, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. Before we start, I want to say this quickly and then I promise I will leave it alone. If you enjoy this kind of quiet, immersive history, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps this little channel keep going, and it costs you nothing but a second. What I would love to know is where you're listening from right now. Maybe you're curled up somewhere in Texas tonight with the air conditioning humming against the heat. Maybe you are in a flat in London with the window thrown all the way open because even the night air will not cool down. I read every single one of those comments. All right, love, let your shoulders drop and let your hands rest. Let's begin. Tonight we are stepping into a world of absurd, staggering, almost unbelievable wealth. What life was really like for the filthy rich during Victorian England. Not the polite version. Not the version where a lady sips tea in a sunlit parlour and everything is simply lovely. The real version, with the real numbers attached to it, the numbers that made Victorian society what it was, and the numbers that, translated into what things cost today, would honestly make your jaw drop a little. It is not the grand staircase I want to start with. Everyone starts with the staircase, the sweep of marble underfoot, the portraits watching from the walls, the practiced pause at the top before descending into a room full of eyes. That is the postcard version, and postcards lie by omission more than they lie by exaggeration. I want to start somewhere smaller. A dressing room, 9:30 in the morning, in a townhouse on Grosvenor Square, London, in the autumn of 1881. A maid is on her knees on the carpet, and she is doing something that will take her nearly 40 minutes. And the woman standing above her has not said a single word in almost 10 of those minutes, because she's thinking about a dinner that is 7 hours away and already quietly exhausting her. Maybe she's a woman you would recognize instantly if you saw her portrait in a museum, all composure and pearl and faint amusement, the kind of face that looks like it has never once been tired. Maybe she's someone closer to the version nobody paints, the one who lies awake some nights doing arithmetic in her head, that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with linen and wine and the wages of 9 people she is responsible for and will never really know. Maybe she is a little of both, because most real people are. Let us call her Lady Rosalind Ashworth, wife of the Earl of Camborne, mistress of a townhouse in Grosvenor Square and a country estate in Devonshire that she visits perhaps 12 weeks of the year. She's 34 years old this autumn. She has been married for 11 years. She has 3 children, a governess, a wet nurse retained years ago and kept on staff long after weaning because the family simply forgot, in the way that very wealthy families sometimes forget things that cost them almost nothing to keep forgetting. The maid on the floor is threading the laces of a corset through eyelets, and the sound it makes, that small rhythmic creak of whalebone under tension, is the actual sound of the morning in this house. Not bird song, not silence. That particular dry mechanical creak repeated perhaps 60 times before the maid ties it off. Here is the paradox sitting quietly in the middle of the room, and nobody in it would ever say it out loud. Lady Rosalind is, by any measure her century can produce, an extraordinarily fortunate woman, and she is also, at this exact moment, being laced into a garment that will make it mildly difficult for her to breathe deeply for the next 14 hours. Because comfort was never really the point of any of this. The point was the shape. The point was always the shape. I find myself thinking about that a great deal when I read into this world. The strange arithmetic of it. Money bought freedom from labour and simultaneously bought a whole new category of constraint that poorer women never had to consider at all, because poorer women could not afford the corset that cost as much as a labourer earned in 2 weeks. Could not afford the 11 yards of silk that had to be cut and fitted and boned into something that photographed, or rather painted, beautifully. Wealth did not remove the cage. It simply built the cage out of better material and called it fashion. We're going to spend tonight inside this world properly, not rushing through it. I want you to feel the weight of the silk, hear the numbers as they are read aloud from a household ledger, understand what a dinner for 18 actually cost in real money, and in real labour. And slowly, as the night deepens and your own eyes grow heavy, I want you to understand something a little larger about what it meant to be filthy rich in Victorian England. It meant having almost everything money could buy. It also meant living inside a performance so continuous, so expensive, and so exhausting that very few of the women inside it ever really got to put it down. The house itself is worth pausing on before we go further, because the house is the frame the whole life sits inside. Number 4, Grosvenor Square. 5 stories including the basement kitchens and excluding the attic servants' rooms, which the family does not count as a story because the family does not really count the people who sleep in them either. The lease alone, the lease, not the purchase, runs to something in the neighbourhood of £400 a year, and that is before a single candle is lit, or a single joint of beef is roasted in the kitchen below. £400 a year was, in 1881, more than double what a skilled tradesman might earn in 12 months of steady work. Below stairs there are 11 servants attached to the London house alone, a number that swells to nearly 30 when the family removes to the country estate for the summer and autumn shooting season, because the country house requires gamekeepers and grooms and gardeners that the London townhouse simply has no use for. A butler, who earns roughly £60 a year and commands more genuine authority inside the household than most junior clerks in the City of London ever will in their careers. A housekeeper, paid slightly less, who controls the linen cupboard with something close to religious devotion and keeps a ledger of her own, separate from the master ledger, that nobody, including the Earl, is permitted to see. A cook, a kitchen maid, 2 housemaids, a scullery maid who is perhaps 13 years old and earns £8 a year, a lady's maid retained specifically for Lady Rosalind, a nursery maid, a footman, and a coachman who lives above the mews 2 streets away with the horses he loves considerably more than he loves most of the humans he serves. Total wage bill for the London staff alone runs to something over £300 a year, and that figure does not include their board, their uniforms, their laundry allowance, or the coal that heats the rooms they sleep in, which the family pays for as a matter of course and barely notices on the ledger. Add the country house staff, add the coachman's stable expenses, add the wine merchant and the coal merchant and the fishmonger and the greengrocer, who all extend credit to the household and settle their accounts quarterly, and you begin to understand that maintaining a family like the Camborne family at the standard their position demands costs somewhere in the region of £8,000 to £10,000 a year. To put that number somewhere you can actually feel it, a schoolteacher in the same city the same year might earn £90 annually if she was fortunate in her position. The household spends roughly 100 times what she earns, simply existing at the level society expects of it. And here is the thing about Lady Rosalind specifically, the thing that makes her useful to understand rather than simply resent from a comfortable historical distance. She does not see any of this as excess. She was raised inside a family of similar standing, married into a family of equivalent standing, and has never once in her adult life needed to ask what something costs before deciding whether to have it. The question simply does not occur to her the way it occurs to you or me. This is not a moral failing exactly. It is closer to a kind of blindness that money that old and that deep produces almost automatically, a blindness her own daughter is already, at age 9, beginning to inherit without anyone teaching it to her directly. Back to the dressing room, because the morning is not finished, not nearly. The corset laced, the maid, whose name is Nora, moves to the underskirts, then the petticoats, layer upon layer, each one adding weight and structure, until the final walking dress goes over the top. A deep plum wool trimmed in dark velvet, cut by a dressmaker on Bond Street who charges roughly £40 for a single day dress of this quality, a sum that would cover Nora's wages for very nearly a full year. Lady Rosalind owns perhaps 30 such dresses at any given moment, not counting evening gowns, not counting the specialised mourning wardrobe kept ready in a separate wardrobe for the inevitable death of some relation or other, because Victorian mourning etiquette required a swift and total change of dress within days of a death being announced, and a woman of Rosalind's position simply could not be caught unprepared. Her hair takes another 20 minutes after the dress is on, built up and over a small horsehair pad to create the fashionable height and volume the decade demands, pinned with perhaps 30 individual hairpins, finished with a small ornament of jet and pearl that cost more than Nora's mother earned taking in washing for an entire month. Nora does this every single morning without visible resentment, or at least without any resentment Lady Rosalind has ever noticed. which tells you something about which direction the noticing runs in a house like this one, and which direction it does not. By 10:30, Lady Rosalind is seated at her writing desk in the morning room, and this is where the first real work of her day begins, work she would never describe using that word, work that is nonetheless real, demanding and continuous. She writes 5 letters before 11 o'clock, one accepting a dinner invitation for the following Thursday, one declining a luncheon on a day she's already committed elsewhere, worded with exactly the correct degree of regret, neither too warm, which would suggest genuine disappointment unbecoming of her rank, nor too cool, which would suggest an insult that could ripple through drawing rooms for weeks. One to her dressmaker regarding an alteration, one to her sister in Yorkshire, genuinely affectionate, the only letter of the morning that cost her nothing in careful calculation, and one to the housekeeper of the Devonshire estate, 3 pages of instruction regarding preparations for the family's arrival in 6 weeks. Because even from 200 miles away, Rosalind is managing 2 households simultaneously, and has been doing so invisibly since she was 23 years old. At 11, the housekeeper comes up for the daily consultation, standing rather than sitting, holding the household ledger open against her forearm while Rosalind reviews yesterday's expenditure and approves today's menu. This is the part of the Victorian lady's day that television adaptations tend to compress into a single, charming scene, and I want to slow it down, because it is genuinely one of the most demanding parts of the job. Yesterday the household consumed 2 legs of mutton, a side of salmon brought up overnight from the coast packed in ice, 4 dozen eggs, 3 pounds of butter, an assortment of hothouse fruit that in November cost a genuine fortune, because hothouse fruit in November means pineapples and grapes grown under glass with coal fires, burning around the clock to keep the frost off them, a luxury so specific to wealth that a single pineapple might run to 2 or 3 pounds, more than a housemaid's monthly wage, for a piece of fruit that will be sliced, arranged, admired, and mostly left uneaten on a dessert plate. The housekeeper reads the figures. Rosalind nods, questions one item, a delivery of wine that seems higher than expected, and is told the merchant raised his prices on the Madeira again, and she accepts this the way she accepts weather. Then they move to today, and tonight's dinner, which is not a large affair by the season standards, only 18 at table, but 18 at table in this world is still an enormous undertaking. 9 courses have been planned. Clear soup, then a cream soup as alternative for those who prefer it, then turbot in a lobster sauce, then a course of sweetbreads, then the saddle of mutton that will use the second leg purchased yesterday, then game, likely pheasant since the country estate sent a crate down by rail 3 days ago, then a sorbet to clear the palate, and here I want to pause, because this detail genuinely delights me every time I encounter it. The sorbet exists purely so that the diners' mouths are reset for the meat course that follows it, an entire small ceremonial dish whose sole purpose is transition, then the roast course, then a sweet course of some elaborate moulded dessert requiring ice, that has been cut from a lake in winter and stored underground, in an ice house specifically built for this purpose, then cheese, then fruit, then coffee, taken separately by the men after the women withdraw. 9 courses, 18 guests, and behind that single evening stands a small army. The cook has been planning this menu for 4 days, the kitchen maid has been peeling, trimming, and preparing since before dawn. A confectioner has been engaged specially for the moulded dessert, because the house cook, however skilled, does not have the particular expertise required for spun sugar work, and his fee alone runs to several pounds for the evening. Flowers have been ordered from a florist on Piccadilly, hothouse blooms again, out of season, extravagantly priced, arranged that afternoon by a woman who does nothing else for a living but arrange flowers for households exactly like this one. The total cost of tonight's dinner, food, wine, flowers, the confectioner's fee, the extra footman hired for the evening because 18 guests requires more hands than the regular staff can provide, comes to something in the range of £40 for one evening, for a dinner that will be eaten, discussed politely, and largely forgotten by most of the guests within a week, while the scullery maid who scrubbed the pots until midnight earns £8 across an entire year. I do not say this to lecture you, and I promise this is not where the evening is headed. I say it because the sheer scale of the disparity is, historically, simply true, and understanding it is part of understanding what filthy rich actually meant in this century. It did not mean comfortable. It did not mean well off. It meant existing at a distance from ordinary economic reality so vast that the two worlds barely touched, except in this one specific place, this kitchen, this dining room, where the labour of one world was quite literally consumed to feed the leisure of the other every single night, without either side finding it particularly remarkable, because it was simply how things were. By noon, the ledger closed and the housekeeper dismissed. Lady Rosalind has perhaps 40 minutes before luncheon, and she spends it, on this particular day, sitting by the window in the small sitting room that adjoins her bedroom, reading. Not a novel, though she reads those too, and has strong opinions about them that she shares with almost no one, but a periodical, one of the illustrated weeklies that arrive by post and are read by women of her class with the same attentiveness that men of her class bring to the financial papers. There is a strange, quiet pleasure in this small window of time, and I want to name it honestly, because it would be a disservice to pretend her whole life was performance, and none of it was simply living. She likes reading. She likes the particular slant of the light through this window at this hour. For 40 minutes, nobody needs anything from her at all, and that fact alone tells you something about how rare unstructured time actually was in a day like hers. Luncheon is a lighter affair than dinner, taken at 1:30, often informal, sometimes with a friend or two invited, sometimes simply the family, though the children eat separately in the nursery under the governess's supervision, and would not join the adult table until considerably older. Cold meats, a light soup, perhaps a fish course, bread, cheese, fruit, nothing on the scale of the evening meal, but still prepared by the same overworked kitchen staff who are simultaneously deep into preparations for tonight. The Earl joins when his schedule permits, though today he does not, being occupied at his club with men discussing investments in railway shares that Rosalind will hear about only in the vaguest terms later, because a wife's involvement in her husband's financial affairs, however substantial her own dowry contributed to those affairs at marriage, is considered, at best, mildly inappropriate. This is worth sitting with for a moment, actually, because it connects to something larger and genuinely important about the era. Under English law for most of the Victorian period, a married woman's property, including any money or land she brought into the marriage, became legally her husband's property upon marriage, a doctrine called coverture that essentially erased a married woman's independent legal existence. It was not until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, the very year that follows the one we are sitting in tonight, that married women in England gained the legal right to own and control property in their own name. Rosalind brought a dowry of £15,000 into this marriage 11 years ago. Every shilling of it has technically belonged to her husband since the morning they were married, a fact she does not dwell on because dwelling on it changes nothing, but a fact that sits underneath the glittering surface of this life like a stone underneath silk. The afternoon belongs to calls, and calls are their own elaborate social technology, one that modern life has no real equivalent for. Between 3 and 5 o'clock, fashionable London society pays and receives visits, and the choreography of it is exact enough to have entire etiquette manuals devoted solely to its rules. A first call after being introduced to someone new must be returned within a specific window. A card left without the visitor herself asking to be received signals one thing. A card with a corner turned down signals another. The length of an acceptable visit is 15 to 20 minutes, no longer, because staying too long suggests you have nothing else, and nowhere else, of importance to be, which is itself a kind of social admission nobody wants to make, even when it happens to be true. Rosalind makes 3 calls this afternoon, in a carriage with the family crest on the door, driven by the coachman who has been waiting in the mews since morning with the horses groomed and harnessed for exactly this purpose. The carriage itself, a well-appointed brougham, cost several £100s to commission, and requires a pair of matched horses whose upkeep, feed, stabling and veterinary care runs to something close to £100 a year, for transportation that exists purely so a woman of her station is never seen walking through central London on her own 2 feet for any meaningful distance, because walking, for a woman like Rosalind, carries an unspoken suggestion of a household that cannot afford otherwise. The first call is to a dowager countess, whose good opinion matters enormously to the current standing of the Camborne name, an elderly woman who receives Rosalind in a drawing-room kept, by preference, slightly too warm, decorated in the fashion of 30 years earlier, and who spends most of the visit discussing a mutual acquaintance' unfortunate choice of husband with a relish that suggests gossip was, and perhaps always will be, one of the genuine unrationed pleasures available to women whose lives were otherwise so carefully rationed in every other respect. The second call is to a younger woman, recently married, whom Rosalind is cultivating gently as a future ally in the drawing rooms that will matter over the coming decade, though neither woman would ever describe the friendship in such transactional terms, even privately, even to themselves. The third call goes unanswered. The lady is not at home, or says she is not, which amounts to the same thing socially, and Rosalind leaves her card with the corner turned down, and returns to the carriage without any particular offence taken, because not being received is simply one of the calculated risks of an afternoon spent calling. Between the second and third calls there is a stop at the dressmaker's, not a full fitting today, simply the collection of a finished garment, and a brief discussion of the gown being made for the Fitzwilliam ball in a fortnight. A gown that will require 11 yards of silk, hand-sewn beading across the bodice. That alone will take a seamstress something close to 60 hours of close, exacting, eye-straining work, and a final cost of nearly £90. A single gown, worn perhaps 3 or 4 times before fashion or occasion moves past it, and it is relegated to the back of the wardrobe, altered for a lesser event, or eventually passed down to a lady's maid as a perquisite of service, which was, incidentally, one of the genuinely valuable non-wage benefits of a position like Nora's, because a cast-off silk evening gown from a woman like Rosalind could be sold or altered into something a lady's maid could never otherwise have afforded to own. I want to pause on the seamstress for a moment, because she is one of the people history tends to lose entirely inside a story like this one. She is not in service to any single household. She works, along with perhaps a dozen other women, in a workroom above the dressmaker's shop on Bond Street, for wages that were, across the 1870s and 80s, the subject of genuine public concern and periodic newspaper investigation into what was called sweated labour, long hours in poor light for pay that in bad seasons barely covered rent and food. The dress Rosalind will wear for perhaps 4 hours at the Fitzwilliam ball represents something close to 2 weeks of another woman's working life, a woman whose name does not appear anywhere in the household ledger, whose existence Rosalind is dimly aware of in the abstract, and has never once had cause to picture in any specific detail: the hunched shoulders, the eye strain, the small cramped room lit by gas that flickers when too many machines run at once. This is not a detail the era advertised. Fashion magazines of the period showed engravings of elegant women in beautiful dresses, and said almost nothing about where those dresses came from, and it would take reformers and journalists through the 1880s and 90s to bring the sweated trades into wider public view in any sustained way. Rosalind, to be fair to her as an individual rather than as a symbol of her class, is not a cruel woman. She tips her own servants generously at Christmas. She donates, through her husband, to a hospital charity every year, a genuine act of goodwill that costs the household perhaps £20 and saves lives it will never hear about. But the distance between her life and the seamstress's life is so total, so architecturally complete, that kindness within it changes almost nothing about the structure itself. By 4:30 Rosalind is home again, and there is tea in the drawing-room, a genuinely restful hour if the day has gone well, taken alone today since the Earl remains at his club and the children are still with the governess. The tea things themselves are worth a moment of attention. Silver service polished daily by a footman whose entire morning, every morning, involves nothing but the care of silver. China painted with a small hand gilded pattern, commissioned specifically for the household, and a tea that arrives from China by way of a merchant house that has supplied the family for 2 generations, blended to a particular taste that Rosalind's mother preferred, and that Rosalind has simply continued without ever quite deciding to. The way daughters often inherit preferences they never consciously chose, and then the getting ready begins again, because it always begins again, and this is perhaps the detail that best captures the strange rhythm of a day like this one. Rosalind was dressed for nearly an hour this morning. She will be dressed again, differently, more elaborately, for close to 2 hours this evening, because a dinner for 18 at 8:30 requires an entirely different presentation than a morning of letters and calls. Nora is back in the dressing room by 6, and this time the corset comes off entirely and goes back on, laced slightly differently, tighter through the waist, because the evening gown is cut to a silhouette the day dress did not require. The gown itself, a deep emerald silk with a low neckline that would have been considered inappropriate for daytime and is entirely appropriate for candlelit evening company, an inconsistency in Victorian modesty rules that fascinated me the first time I properly understood it. The same expanse of shoulder and collarbone that would scandalize a morning caller is perfectly acceptable, even expected, once the sun goes down and the candles are lit. The jewels come out now, kept in a locked case that only Rosalind and Nora have keys to, a case that lives inside a larger safe built into the wall behind a false panel in the dressing room, installed at some expense, specifically because jewel theft from wealthy London households was a genuine and recurring concern of the period, reported on periodically in the newspapers with a mixture of scandal and vicarious fascination. Tonight it is the sapphires, a parure, meaning a matched set, necklace, earrings, and a small brooch that belonged to the Earl's mother and passed to Rosalind at her wedding, insured for an amount that would purchase a modest house outright, worn for perhaps 5 hours tonight, and then locked away again until the next occasion calls for them. Her hair is redone, not simply adjusted but genuinely redone, taken down and rebuilt with fresh curls set using a heated iron that Nora keeps warming on a small spirit lamp throughout the process, testing the heat against a scrap of paper before it ever touches Rosalind's hair, because too hot an iron on 1880s hair could scorch it, and a scorched curl in the middle of an elaborate evening style was the kind of small disaster that could genuinely ruin an entire evening's careful presentation. Powder is applied, lightly, the same rice powder from the morning, but a touch more generous now, because candlelight is forgiving in some ways and unforgiving in others, and a slightly heavier hand with powder helps the complexion hold its composure under gaslight and candle flame for the 4 or 5 hours a formal dinner requires. By 8 o'clock she is dressed, jewelled, powdered, and standing at the top of the staircase beside her husband, who is changed into evening dress, black tailcoat, white waistcoat, white tie, a uniform so standardized among men of his class that the only real individuality permitted is in the quality of the cloth and the cut of the tailor, and together they wait for the sound of the first carriage arriving below. The guests arrive in a staggered procession over the next 20 minutes, each carriage announced by the footman at the door. Each name called out as the couple or individual crosses the threshold into the hall, and Rosalind's job for these 20 minutes is possibly the single hardest performance of her entire day, because it must look effortless while being in fact an act of considerable social calculation performed in real time. She must remember which of tonight's 18 guests are meeting for the first time and require a proper introduction. She must remember which 2 gentlemen had a disagreement over a matter of business several months ago and cannot under any circumstances be seated near each other at dinner. She must remember that Lady Featherstone, arriving now in violet silk that clashes rather badly with the room's decor, is recently widowed and should be greeted with slightly more warmth than usual, and that her son, arriving separately, is currently the subject of some unflattering rumour that must not, tonight, in this house, be so much as alluded to. A seating plan, decided 2 days earlier and revised twice since, has been placed at each setting on small printed cards, and getting it right is genuinely consequential in a way that seems almost impossible to a modern listener. Precedence, the formal ranking of guests by title and social standing, dictated who went into dinner with whom, on whose arm, and who sat where at the table, and getting this wrong, seating a baronet's wife below where her husband's rank technically entitled her, could produce weeks of coldness, could damage a friendship, could, in the worst instances that occasionally made their way into gossip columns, produce a genuine and lasting social rupture between families. Rosalind has spent real careful thought on this seating plan, and if you had asked her whether she considered this work, she would have looked at you with genuine confusion, because to her it is simply what a hostess does, the way breathing is simply what a body does. At 8:30 the company moves through to the dining room, and here I want you to picture it properly, because the room itself is doing a great deal of the evening's work. The table, extended with additional leaves to seat 18, is dressed in a damask cloth ironed that afternoon by a housemaid using irons heated on the kitchen range, because there was of course no electric iron in 1881, only heavy metal irons reheated constantly against a fire, a task that left more than one housemaid with burn scars across her forearms that she carried for the rest of her life. Down the center of the table runs an epergne, a large ornamental silver centerpiece holding hothouse fruit and flowers, flanked by candelabra whose candles, again, are real wax candles requiring constant attention throughout the evening, trimmed periodically by a footman moving quietly around the room's edges so as never to interrupt the flow of conversation with anything so crude as visible labor. The soup arrives first, carried in by footmen whose movements have been drilled to a precision that borders on choreography, served from the left, cleared from the right, a rule so fixed among trained household staff that a new footman who reversed it would be corrected sharply by the butler the moment the guests had left the room. Conversation at this stage is general, the whole table participating loosely, but as the courses progress the etiquette shifts, and each guest is expected to divide their conversation carefully between the person on their right and the person on their left across the length of the meal, never monopolizing one neighbor for the entire evening, a rule that turns even casual dinner conversation into something with an invisible structure and timing to it, something Rosalind manages instinctively after years of practice, but that a newly married young hostess dining in this same room for the first time might find genuinely terrifying. Turbot comes next, poached whole and dressed in a lobster sauce that the cook has been reducing since early afternoon. And here is a small detail I genuinely love, the kind of thing that never makes it into the grand histories but tells you everything about the era's relationship to abundance. Fish this fresh, this far from the coast, required the salmon and turbot to travel overnight packed in ice on the express trains that had by the 1880s transformed what wealthy London households could serve at all. A generation earlier, a dinner like this one would have been built entirely around what could be sourced locally or preserved. By 1881, the railway had quietly rewritten what luxury even meant, collapsing distance into a kind of edible immediacy that guests took entirely for granted, admiring the fish without ever once wondering how a creature caught off the Cornish coast the previous morning had arrived, still cold, still fresh, on a plate in Mayfair by evening. Sweetbreads follow, a dish that would strike a modern listener as strange, being the thymus or pancreas of a calf, prepared with a delicacy and technical skill that Victorian cookery genuinely prized, considered a mark of a sophisticated kitchen precisely because the ingredient itself was difficult to source, difficult to prepare correctly, and impossible to disguise if handled badly. Then the saddle of mutton, carved at a side table by the butler himself rather than a footman, because carving well was considered a skill significant enough to be reserved for the most senior servant in the room, each slice laid with a precision that had taken the butler decades to perfect, and that none of the 18 guests would ever think to compliment him on directly, because complimenting a servant on skilled labor, in this world, would be a strange breach of the invisible wall the whole system depended on. The pheasant course arrives with all the ceremony of the mutton before it, and by now 3 hours into the evening, the room has grown warm from the candles and the bodies and the low steady conversation, and Rosalind, seated at the head of the table opposite her husband, is doing the quiet, continuous, invisible work of monitoring the whole room at once even as she carries on her own conversation, watching for the guest whose wineglass has sat too long empty, noticing the young woman 3 seats down who has said almost nothing all evening, and gently drawing her into a question she can answer easily, tracking the general temperature of the table the way a conductor tracks an orchestra, adjusting without ever once appearing to adjust anything at all. Then the sorbet arrives, that small strange interlude I mentioned earlier, and I still find something almost moving about it, honestly, the idea that an entire course exists purely to clear the palate, purely to mark a transition, a whole ritual object built around nothing but preparation for what comes next. Then the roast, then the sweet, the confectioner's elaborate moulded dessert finally making its appearance to a small ripple of genuine admiration around the table, a spun sugar construction shaped like a swan that took the confectioner the better part of the afternoon to complete, and that will be almost entirely uneaten, admired more than consumed, because by this point in a 9-course dinner, admiration is really the only appetite most of the guests have left. Cheese and fruit close the meal proper, and then comes the moment that always strikes modern listeners as slightly strange the first time they learn about it. Rosalind rises, catches the eye of the senior lady present, and the women withdraw together to the drawing room, leaving the men at the table with the port, the cigars, and presumably whatever conversation men of this class considered unsuitable for mixed company, politics most likely, or business, or the kind of joke that would not survive translation into a drawing room. This separation, so formalized it had its own name, the ladies withdrawing, gave the hostess one final and genuinely important task for the evening, managing the conversation of a dozen women in a drawing room for the better part of an hour with no male guests present to defer to or perform for, which strangely, several of the women who kept diaries from this period noted, produced some of the most honest and unguarded conversation of the entire evening, women speaking more freely about books, about children, about each other, once the men were safely elsewhere with their port. The men rejoin around 10:30, and the evening shifts again into music now, a young woman among the guests persuaded, with the correct degree of polite reluctance, to play the piano, another guest with a fine tenor voice singing 2 songs to general and genuine appreciation, and beneath the music, quiet conversation continues in clusters around the room, alliances and friendships, and the occasional careful negotiation of a future match between 2 families' children, still years from marriageable age, but already, in rooms exactly like this one, being quietly considered. By midnight the first carriages are called, and the departure follows its own precise choreography in reverse. Guests thanking Rosalind individually at the door, the correct words in the correct order, the correct duration of warmth in the handshake or the cheek offered for a kiss depending on the closeness of the relationship. By midnight the last guest has gone, and the house that was, an hour ago, full of candlelight and conversation and 18 distinct social performances happening simultaneously, is suddenly almost violently quiet. The footmen begin clearing, the candles are extinguished one by one. Rosalind stands for a moment in the empty dining room, the smell of melted wax and spent flowers, and the ghost of 9 courses of food still hanging faintly in the warm air. And for the first time since 6:30 this evening, nobody in the house needs anything from her at all. I think this moment, more than almost any other in her day, is the one worth sitting with, because it is the moment where the performance genuinely ends, where the room empties of the eyes that have been in one way or another on her since Nora first knocked at her door that morning, and what is left in the silence is simply a tired woman in a heavy silk dress, standing in a room that smells faintly of wax and wine, thinking, probably, about nothing more dramatic than whether the fish course was slightly overdone, and whether Lady Featherstone seemed, tonight, a little more at peace than she had been in recent weeks. Let us step back from this single day for a while, because a single day, however carefully rendered, can only tell you so much. The dinner we just sat through together was not an unusual evening for the Camborne household. It was, if anything, a fairly ordinary Tuesday by the standards of the London season, that stretch of the year running roughly from April through July when Parliament sat, when the weather in London was tolerable, and when the entire machinery of upper-class social life moved from the countryside into town, and operated at something close to full capacity for 4 solid months. During the season, a household like the Cambornes might host or attend a formal dinner several nights a week, alongside luncheons, garden parties, evenings at the opera, where a box at Covent Garden for the season could run to several £100 on its own, and of course the balls, which were, in their way, the single most expensive and most anxiety-inducing events on the entire calendar. A ball hosted by a family of the Cambornes standing might involve 200 guests or more, an orchestra hired for the evening, a supper served at midnight nearly as elaborate as the dinner we just walked through, flowers enough to fill an entire ballroom, and a total cost that could run well into the hundreds of pounds for a single night, a sum that, converted honestly into today's money accounting for both inflation and the simple relative cost of skilled labour, would sit somewhere in the tens of thousands of pounds by modern standards, spent entirely on a single evening of dancing that would be over by 3 in the morning and largely forgotten within the month, except by whichever young woman had, or had not, been successfully introduced to whichever eligible young man her mother had spent the entire evening quietly steering her toward, because that, underneath all the silk and the sugar swans, was very often the actual engine driving the enormous expense of the season. Daughters had to be presented at court, a formal ceremony where young women of the upper classes, dressed in gowns that were themselves a small fortune, complete with the required ostrich feathers worn in the hair and a train of a specified length trailing behind them, were brought before the reigning monarch in a ritual that functioned as a kind of official entry into marriageable society. The gown alone for a court presentation might cost £60 or £70, worn precisely once, for an event lasting perhaps 90 seconds in the actual royal presence, after weeks of preparation and rehearsal in how to walk backward gracefully away from the monarch without ever turning one's back, a skill genuinely practiced at home with a maid holding an imaginary train, because getting it wrong in front of the actual court was a humiliation some young women apparently never fully recovered from socially. I find something both absurd and quietly moving in that image. A young woman practicing, again and again, in the privacy of her own bedroom, how to walk backward in a heavy gown without tripping, rehearsing a single 90-second moment that her entire family's social future had, in some real sense, been quietly organized around for years. The stakes felt enormous because, within the closed logic of this world, they genuinely were. Let us talk properly about the wardrobe, because I promised you numbers that would genuinely surprise you, and the wardrobe is where those numbers live most vividly. A woman of Rosalind's standing was expected to change clothes multiple times a day, a morning dress for breakfast and letters, a walking dress for calls and errands, an afternoon dress if receiving visitors at home, a tea gown for the more relaxed hour before dinner, and then the evening gown itself, each garment distinct, each cut and trimmed for its specific purpose, and each one representing a genuine and considerable expenditure. Household accounts that survive from families of this class suggest an annual clothing budget for the lady of the house alone running anywhere from £300 to as much as £1,500 a year, depending on the family's wealth and the social demands placed on them, a figure that, again, needs to sit against the £90 a year a schoolteacher might earn, or the £60 a year the butler commanded as one of the more senior and better compensated members of the household staff. £1,500 a year on clothing was, in the London of 1881, more than most professional men earned in total across an entire year of work, and this was not considered scandalous within Rosalind's world. It was considered appropriate, even necessary, because a woman's dress was understood, quite explicitly, as a direct visible signal of her husband's success, his standing, his ability to provide at a level commensurate with his rank. A wife who dressed shabbily did not merely embarrass herself, she embarrassed her husband, publicly, in a way that could genuinely affect his professional and social standing. The dress, in other words, was never really just about vanity, however much it might have looked that way from the outside. It was advertising, worn on a body, walking through drawing rooms on behalf of a family whose entire social position depended, in part, on exactly this kind of continuous, expensive, visible display. And then there was mourning, which deserves its own moment of attention because it represents one of the strangest intersections of grief and expenditure in the entire era. When a close relation died, etiquette required an immediate and total shift into mourning dress, black crepe and bombazine for the deepest first stage, gradually easing over months into what was called half-mourning, greys and lavenders and muted purples, before finally returning to ordinary colour after a period that could stretch, for a widow mourning her husband, to a full 2 years or longer by strict etiquette, though in practice many women moved through the stages somewhat faster. A family of Rosalind's standing kept a portion of the wardrobe permanently ready for this eventuality, because death, in a century with considerably higher mortality rates across every age group than we experience today, arrived often enough that being caught without appropriate mourning clothes was considered a genuine social failing, a sign of a household not properly prepared for the ordinary rhythms of life and death that governed everyone, rich and poor alike. Though the rich naturally mourned in considerably more expensive fabric, summer brought a different rhythm entirely. When the London season ended and the family removed to the country, to Camborne Hall in Devonshire, a house that had stood in various forms on the same ground since the 1600s, expanded and remodelled by successive generations until it reached its current form, 42 rooms not counting the servants' quarters, set within grounds that included formal gardens, a lake stocked with carp that nobody in the family had eaten in living memory, because catching and eating your own ornamental fish would have struck everyone as faintly absurd, and several thousand acres of farmland let out to tenant farmers whose rents formed the actual economic foundation the entire glittering London life was quietly built upon. This detail matters more than it might first appear. The wealth on display in Grosvenor Square, the silk and the sapphires and the 9-course dinners, did not simply exist in the abstract. It came from somewhere specific, and that somewhere, for a family like the Cambornes, was land, was rent, was the labour of tenant farmers working fields their families had worked for generations, paying rent to a landlord most of them had met perhaps twice in their lives, at the annual rent audit dinner, a strange yearly ritual where tenants gathered at the great house to pay their rent in person and were rewarded with a meal, a genuine gesture of goodwill that also, quite efficiently, reinforced exactly whose land they were standing on, and exactly whose generosity they were currently benefiting from. At Camborne Hall the household swells considerably for the summer and autumn, gamekeepers hired specifically for the shooting season that begins in August, when guests arrive for shooting parties that can run to a week or more at a time, each day beginning with an elaborate breakfast, moving into the actual shoot itself, which required beaters. Men and boys from the local village paid a few shillings a day to walk the fields driving birds toward the guns, a job that was hard, cold, repetitive, and considerably more physically demanding than anything the gentlemen firing the guns would experience that day, before returning for a lunch served, remarkably, out in the field itself, hampers packed by the kitchen staff and carried out by footmen, an elaborate meal eaten standing or seated on portable stools in the middle of a Devonshire field in October, because even leisure in this world required its own considerable infrastructure of invisible labour to sustain it. The evenings at Camborne Hall during a shooting party followed much the same pattern as the London dinners, if anything slightly more elaborate, since guests were staying for days rather than hours, and the household's reputation as a host rested on sustaining that level of hospitality night after night without any visible strain. Rosalind, managing this alongside her London obligations, kept the country house running through weekly correspondence with the Devonshire housekeeper even while she was 200 miles away in London, an entire parallel household existing in her mind at all times, menus approved by post, linen inventories reviewed by post, a leaking roof over the West Wing servants' quarters approved for repair by post, 3 weeks before she would even see the damage herself, because the housekeeper's word on such matters was, by this point in their long working relationship, trusted absolutely. There is something worth pausing on here about where all this money actually came from, because filthy rich as a phrase tends to conjure an image of pure inherited privilege sitting untouched for centuries, and while that was certainly part of the picture for families like the Cambornes, the 1880s were also a period when the sources of great wealth in England were quietly significantly shifting. Land had been the traditional foundation of aristocratic fortune for centuries, but by this decade agricultural depression, driven partly by cheap grain imports arriving from America and elsewhere by steamship, was beginning to erode rental income from estates like Camborne Hall in ways that made older families genuinely anxious about the future, even as they maintained every outward appearance of untroubled abundance. Meanwhile, a newer kind of wealth, built on railways, on manufacturing, on banking and international trade, was producing fortunes that in some cases dwarfed the old landed estates entirely, and the old aristocracy watched this new money arrive at their balls and their dinner tables with a complicated mixture of financial dependence and social condescension, needing the marriages and the investment capital that new money could provide, while still, in private conversation, drawing sharp and sometimes cruel distinctions between old blood and new money. Income tax itself is worth a small digression, because it existed throughout this period, reintroduced permanently in 1842 after an earlier wartime version had lapsed, but at rates that would strike a modern listener as almost comically low, generally a matter of a few pence in the pound. meaning a tiny single-digit percentage of income, nothing remotely close to the proportion of wealth that governments would eventually claim from high earners in the following century. A family like the Cambornes paid income tax, certainly, but it barely dented the flow of money through a household running on rents, investments, and in this case a dowry that technically now belonged to the Earl entirely. The vast, almost frictionless accumulation of wealth at the top of Victorian society during this period is part of what made the disparities we have been discussing tonight so extreme and so visible. A scullery maid earning £8 a year existing, quite literally, under the same roof as expenditure of £40 for a single dinner, with almost nothing in the tax system of the era designed to narrow that gap in any meaningful way. And yet, I want to be careful here, because history rarely rewards the tidy villain and the tidy victim narrative, however satisfying that narrative can feel. Many wealthy Victorian households, including ones very much like the Cambornes, did give substantially to charitable causes, funded hospitals, endowed schools, supported the kind of organised philanthropy that built genuine and lasting public institutions, some of which still exist today. The same social system that produced the corset creaking under Nora's careful hands also produced, from within its own ranks, reformers who spent their lives working to dismantle exactly the inequalities their birth had placed them comfortably above. Neither fact cancels the other out. Both were simply, simultaneously, true. Let me take you somewhere in the house we have not been yet tonight, because I think it matters, and because the contrast is instructive without needing me to comment on it too heavily. Up under the roof of the Grosvenor Square house, past the family's bedrooms, past the nursery, up a narrower staircase with no carpet on it at all, just bare worn wood, are the servants' rooms. Nora shares hers with the other lady's maid retained for occasional guests, a small room with a single window, a washstand considerably plainer than the one in Rosalind's dressing room, 2 narrow beds, and a fireplace that is lit only on the coldest nights of the year, because coal for the servants' quarters is rationed in a way coal for the family's rooms simply is not. At midnight, while Rosalind stands in the empty dining room breathing in the smell of spent candles, Nora is already upstairs, having been dismissed once her mistress was safely into her nightgown and her hair brushed out and braided for sleep. Nora's day began at 5:30 this morning, nearly 17 hours before this moment, and it will begin again at 5:30 tomorrow, 6 days a week, with perhaps a half-day free on alternate Sundays if the household schedule permits it. She earns £22 a year, a genuinely good wage for a lady's maid, better than a housemaid, because Nora's particular skills, hairdressing, needlework, an eye for fashion good enough to advise her mistress on trims and alterations, are valued and comparatively scarce. £22 a year, room, board, and a cast-off silk dress now and then. It is not a bad position by the standards available to a woman of her background. It is also, by any honest measure, an entire life organised around someone else's convenience, with almost no time, ever, that genuinely belongs to her alone. I do not say this to make you feel guilty about anything, lying there tonight in your own warm bed, with nobody waiting to brush your hair out or lace you into anything at all. I say it because I think real history, the kind worth actually sitting with rather than simply consuming as costume drama, holds both truths in the same hand without letting go of either one. Rosalind's life was genuinely remarkable, genuinely privileged, filled with beauty and comfort most people across most of human history could never have imagined for themselves, and it rested entirely on the labour of people like Nora, whose own remarkable, complicated, largely undocumented lives rarely survive in the historical record with anything like the same detail, because nobody thought to keep Nora's letters, nobody commissioned Nora's portrait, and the household ledger that records, with such precision, the cost of the sapphires and the turbot and the 11 yards of silk, records Nora herself as a single annual line item, £22, paid quarterly, and nothing more. Let us drift forward a few months, because I want to show you a different kind of day, one that reveals another facet of what filthy rich actually meant beyond dinners and dresses. It is February now, deep winter, and Rosalind is not in London at all but in Harrogate, a spa town in Yorkshire that had by the 1880s become genuinely fashionable among the wealthy for its mineral waters and its claimed restorative properties, a place where women of her class went for a few weeks at a time, ostensibly for their health, though the actual medical benefit of drinking sulphurous spring water that smelled by most contemporary accounts distinctly of rotten eggs was considerably more modest than the fashionable reputation suggested. She has taken rooms at one of the better hotels, brought Nora with her of course, along with a footman to manage luggage and errands, and her days here follow a gentler rhythm than London. Mornings spent taking the waters at the pump room, a genuinely social occasion despite its medicinal framing, where the wealthy of several counties gathered each morning to drink a small glass of the famously unpleasant water while catching up on news and gossip that had travelled up from London over the preceding weeks. Afternoons are for walking in the gardens if the weather allows, or, more often in February, sitting by the fire in the hotel's private drawing-room reading, writing letters, receiving the small circle of acquaintances who happen to be taking the waters the same fortnight. The cost of 3 weeks at Harrogate, hotel rooms for herself and 2 servants, meals, the various small entertainments the town offered, treatments at the bathhouse itself, comes to something in the range of £60 or £70, a sum that, again, exceeds an entire year's wages for the footman standing quietly by the door of her hotel suite each evening, waiting to be told he may retire for the night. And this is the part I find genuinely fascinating about wealth at this level, the way it created an entirely separate geography of leisure, spa towns and seaside resorts, and eventually, as the century progressed, destinations on the continent that existed almost as a parallel England, populated almost exclusively by people who had never once needed to calculate whether they could afford the trip, moving through a landscape of hotels and pump rooms and bathhouses that had been built, quite specifically, to receive exactly this kind of unhurried, well-funded, faintly bored leisure. There is a particular quality of boredom that surfaces in some of the diaries and letters that survive from women of Rosalind's class during periods like this one, and I think it deserves honest acknowledgement rather than dismissal. A life with almost every practical need met, almost every material want satisfiable within days if not hours, and almost no meaningful work in the sense that word carries for most people across most of history, produces its own particular kind of restlessness. Rosalind is not unhappy exactly, sitting by the fire in her Harrogate hotel room this February afternoon, but she has, on quiet afternoons like this one, more time to think than her London life ever really permits her, and what she thinks about, sometimes, is a question she would never say aloud to anyone, not even her husband, which is simply what all of this is actually for. Health, actually, is worth its own honest look, because wealth bought Rosalind something in this department that money could not fully purchase for anyone in her century, rich or poor, though it came remarkably close. When one of her children fell seriously ill 3 winters ago, a physician was summoned within the hour, a specialist consulted within the day, the child moved to a warmer room with a fire kept burning around the clock, and a night nurse retained specifically to sit with him until the fever broke. Contrast this with the experience of a family in the East End of London that same winter, where the same illness, without access to a physician who could be paid to come immediately, without a spare warm room, without the resources to hire a dedicated night nurse, carried a considerably higher chance of ending in a small grave rather than a recovered child. Infant and child mortality in this period was brutally indifferent to class, in the sense that disease did not check a birth certificate before choosing its victims, but survival, the actual odds of pulling a sick child through a dangerous fever, were shaped enormously and unfairly by exactly the kind of resources a family like the Cambornes could summon without a second thought. This is, I think, one of the genuinely important things wealth bought in this century that deserves to be named plainly, rather than folded into the general glamour of silk and sapphires. Not just comfort, not just status, a meaningfully better chance of keeping your children alive, of surviving your own illnesses, of recovering from injuries that might have killed a poorer person simply through lack of timely, competent care. The unfairness of this runs so deep and so consistently through the entire era that it is almost impossible to overstate, and I think it is worth sitting with for a moment, rather than rushing past it toward the next beautiful dress. Travel abroad became an increasingly common feature of wealthy Victorian life as the decades progressed, and Rosalind and her husband had spent 6 weeks on the continent during the first year of their marriage, a journey that took them through France and into Italy, Paris, then Florence, then Rome, following a route that generations of wealthy English travellers before them had already worn into something like a tradition, visiting galleries and ruins with a guidebook in hand, staying in hotels that had learnt, through decades of hosting exactly this kind of visitor, precisely what an English aristocratic party expected in terms of service, food and quiet. She still has, pressed into a small leather album, a handful of photographs from that journey, a genuinely new technology at the time, expensive enough that having yourself photographed in front of a Roman ruin was itself a small marker of means, and she looks at them sometimes, on quiet evenings, remembering a version of herself 6 years younger and considerably less tired than the woman who stood in the empty dining room a few months ago, breathing in the smell of spent candles. June brings Ascot, and Ascot brings its own entirely distinct set of expenses and anxieties, chief among them the question of what to wear, since the royal enclosure carried its own strict dress requirements, and being seen there, in the right dress, among the right company, mattered enormously to a family's standing for the rest of the season. Rosalind's Ascot wardrobe this year runs to 3 separate outfits for the 3 days she attends, each with its own hat, an entire separate category of expense in itself, since a fashionable hat from a good milliner could run to several pounds on its own, trimmed with feathers, sometimes genuinely exotic feathers, imported from birds most of her guests would never have seen alive, ostrich and egret, and occasionally, controversially even by the standards of the time, birds hunted specifically and unsustainably for the plume trade that fed exactly this kind of fashionable demand. The races themselves matter considerably less to Rosalind than the social theatre surrounding them. The carriages parked in a long glittering row along the course, guests moving between them for conversation, the whole event functioning as an enormous outdoor drawing room where the actual horses running past are, for many in attendance, almost incidental to the real business of the day, which is being seen, being admired, being correctly dressed, and gathering the season's gossip in its most concentrated and immediate form. A hamper lunch is served from the carriage, prepared that morning by the London kitchen, and packed with the same care as any formal meal. Cold chicken, a lobster salad, champagne kept cool, in ice packed specially for the journey, because even a day at the races required its own small production of catering, transported by cart ahead of the family's own carriage. Opera occupies a similar space in the calendar, a box at Covent Garden held for the season, and here again the actual performance competes, quite openly, with the social function of simply being present. Other boxes visible across the house, opera glasses turned as often toward the audience as toward the stage, a genuinely strange inversion that period commentators noted with some amusement even at the time. The idea that one might attend the opera primarily to be looked at rather than to listen. Rosalind does in fact love music genuinely, remember the Schubert she plays alone in the evenings when no one is watching, and there is a particular quiet pleasure she takes in the performances that has nothing to do with being seen, a pleasure she rarely mentions to anyone because it does not fit neatly into the performance the rest of her life requires of her. Children deserve their own honest look too, because their lives, even within this extraordinary wealth, were shaped by rules and expectations almost as rigid as anything governing their mother. The eldest, a boy named Edward, is 7 and spends his days largely with a governess until he reaches an age when he will be sent away to a preparatory school, and then, in the natural course of things for a boy of his class, to Eton, a trajectory decided essentially at birth and never seriously questioned by anyone in the family. The governess herself, a genuinely educated woman named Miss Whitfield, who reads Latin better than most of the men at Rosalind's dinner table, occupies one of the strangest social positions in the entire household, neither quite family nor quite servant, eating neither with the family in the dining room nor with the staff below stairs, taking her meals instead in a small room of her own, a kind of permanent social limbo that period writers occasionally referred to with genuine sympathy, recognizing the particular loneliness of an educated woman employed to educate children. She would never be considered the social equal of their parents. Edward's younger sister, Margaret, 4 years old, will follow a different and in some ways more constrained path, taught to read and write and draw and play the piano to a genteel standard, taught French by a visiting tutor, but never expected or particularly encouraged toward the kind of rigorous classical education her brother will receive, because a girl of her class was being prepared for a specific and singular outcome, a good marriage, and the accomplishments considered valuable toward that outcome were narrower, more decorative, and more carefully calibrated than anything her brother would study. Rosalind, who reads more widely and thinks more sharply than most of the men at her own dinner table, sometimes watches Margaret at her lessons with a complicated expression that Nora has noticed but never asked about, because some things, even between a lady and the maid who knows her better than almost anyone else alive, simply are not discussed directly. The whole machinery of this childhood, the governess's salary, the tutors, the eventual school fees that will run to a genuinely enormous sum once Edward is old enough for Eton, exists within a larger and mostly unspoken understanding that the children themselves are, in a real sense, being prepared as investments in the family's continued social position, Edward to inherit the title and the estate and carry the name forward, Margaret to marry well and extend the family's network of alliance into some other equally advantageous household. Love exists here too, genuine and real. Rosalind adores both children in a way that comes through clearly in the handful of surviving letters from women in her position, but the love operates alongside a structure of expectation so total and so rarely examined that separating the two, in this world, was almost impossible even for the people living inside it. Christmas at Camborne Hall is its own enormous production, the family removing to Devonshire in mid-December and remaining through the new year, the house filled with guests for the holiday in a tradition that had, by the 1880s, been considerably shaped by the royal family's own well-publicised enthusiasm for an elaborately decorated Christmas tree, a custom that had spread rapidly through fashionable society over the preceding decades until nearly every household of means considered a large decorated tree, lit with real candles clipped carefully to the branches and watched with genuine anxiety by whichever footman had been assigned the job of standing nearby with a bucket of water in case of fire, an absolute necessity of the season. The Christmas dinner itself rivals anything served during the London season, a goose or a turkey alongside the traditional beef, a plum pudding that the kitchen has been preparing since October, wrapped and stored to develop its flavour over the following weeks, brought to the table finally alight with brandy poured over it and set aflame at the last moment, a small blue fire flickering across the pudding's dark surface while the assembled family and guests watched with the kind of delighted attention that suggests this particular ritual, unlike so much else in this world, was genuinely, simply joyful, without a great deal of social calculation attached to it at all. Gifts are exchanged, and here too the numbers would surprise you. Not because any single gift was necessarily extravagant by the standards of everything else we have discussed tonight, but because of how many people, across the entire household, received something. Rosalind kept a list, updated yearly, of every servant in both houses, down to the youngest scullery maid, and saw to it personally that each received a gift and a small cash bonus at Christmas, typically modest by her own standards, a few shillings, perhaps a length of fabric or a warm shawl, but genuinely meaningful to the recipients, several months' worth in some cases of what little discretionary spending they might otherwise have had. This tradition of household Christmas generosity was widespread enough across wealthy Victorian families that it functioned as one of the more consistent, if still deeply unequal, redistributions of wealth built into the calendar of the era, a small crack of genuine warmth running through a system otherwise built almost entirely around maintaining distance. The sapphires travelled to Devonshire in their locked case for the holiday, along with the rest of the jewellery Rosalind might need for the various dinners and gatherings the season demands, and their insurance, arranged through a broker in the city who specialises in exactly this kind of coverage for households like the Cambornes, runs to a genuinely substantial annual premium, a cost that exists purely because the theft of exactly this kind of portable, easily liquidated wealth was common enough, reported often enough in the newspapers, that no family of real means travelled with valuable jewellery uninsured, and more than one household, over the preceding decade, had lost a fortune in gems to servants who had, after years of quiet proximity to unimaginable wealth, finally decided to simply take some small portion of it for themselves. There was in fact a theft in a household not far from the Cambornes' own circle. 2 winters before the year we have mostly been sitting inside tonight, and the story circulated through drawing rooms for months afterward, with the particular relish that scandal always seems to generate among people whose own lives are otherwise so carefully controlled. A housemaid, employed for nearly 6 years in a respectable Belgravia household, was discovered to have been slowly removing small items from her mistress's jewellery box over an extended period, not large pieces that would be immediately missed, but smaller things, a pair of earrings here, a brooch there, sold through an intermediary to a pawnbroker in a part of London her employers would never have set foot in. She was caught eventually, tried, and sentenced to a term of imprisonment that effectively ended any future prospect of respectable domestic service, her entire working life foreclosed by a handful of items whose combined value probably would not have covered a single evening's flowers at one of Rosalind's dinner parties. I bring this up not to moralize about theft, but because the story, as it travelled through Rosalind's social circle, was told almost entirely from one direction: the violation of trust, the ingratitude, the danger of allowing servants too much unsupervised access to valuables, and almost never from the other direction, the 6 years of daily invisible labour this woman had provided in exchange for wages that, even added together across those 6 years, would not have matched the value of what she eventually stood trial for stealing. Nobody in the drawing rooms discussing this scandal seemed to find that comparison particularly relevant, and I think that itself tells you something true and slightly uncomfortable about how completely this society had normalized the specific arithmetic of who owed what to whom. Fortunes like the Cambornes were not, of course, entirely secure, however permanent they might have appeared from inside Rosalind's daily life. The agricultural depression I mentioned earlier continued deepening through the 1880s, and more than one landed family of similar standing found themselves, within a decade or two, quietly selling land, mortgaging estates, or arranging marriages for their sons and daughters with considerably more attention to the prospective spouse's fortune than to affection, a pattern that produced its own particular genre of unhappy alliance, wealthy American heiresses in particular becoming increasingly sought after by cash-strapped English aristocratic families. Through the final decades of the century, their fortunes exchanged, quite explicitly, for a title their own money could not otherwise purchase. It is worth remembering, whenever this world starts to feel too permanent, too solid, that within 30 or 40 years of the evening we spent inside the Camborne's dining room, a great many households exactly like theirs would find the entire structure, the servants, the land, the London seasons, dramatically and in some cases catastrophically diminished by economic pressure, by changing social attitudes, and eventually by a war that would take sons like Edward in numbers the previous century could scarcely have imagined. Shopping itself, as an activity distinct from the dressmaker and the milliner, was undergoing its own quiet transformation during exactly these years, and it is worth pausing on, because it changed what it felt like to be wealthy in London in ways that are easy to overlook. William Whiteley had opened what he called the Universal Provider in Bayswater some years earlier, expanding steadily through the 70s and 80s into something recognizably close to a modern department store, an enormous establishment where a woman like Rosalind could, in a single visit, browse silks, order furniture, arrange for groceries, and select stationery, all under one roof, served by an army of shop assistants trained to a standard of deference that made the whole experience feel less like commerce and more like a kind of theatre performed specifically for her benefit. This mattered because it changed the rhythm of consumption itself, made buying things faster, more visually abundant, more immediately gratifying than the older pattern of separate visits to separate specialist tradesmen scattered across the city. Rosalind visits Whiteley's perhaps twice a month, sometimes for something specific, more often simply to look, to see what new silks had arrived from the continent, what new style of glove was being shown this season, and the shop assistants, recognizing her by name and rank within moments of her entering, treated every visit with an attentiveness that a woman of lesser means, browsing the very same counters, would simply never receive, the deference calibrated as precisely to visible wealth as everything else in this world. Beauty rituals occupied real time and real money too, beyond the morning cold cream and rice powder we already walked through together. There were specific creams for the hands, kept soft through a combination of glycerin and careful avoidance of any task that might roughen them, a state of deliberate physical delicacy that itself functioned as a class marker, since a housemaid's hands, chapped and reddened from scrubbing floors and washing linens in cold water, told their own story about a life spent in labour that Rosalind's smooth, cared-for hands were specifically designed never to suggest. There were treatments for the complexion, various concoctions of egg white and lemon, and, in some of the more elaborate beauty manuals circulating among wealthy women of the period, recommendations that ranged from genuinely sensible to faintly alarming by modern medical understanding. Arsenic wafers among the more unsettling examples, taken by some fashionable women in small controlled doses in the belief that it produced a particularly prized pale, luminous complexion, a practice that occasionally tragically produced poisoning rather than beauty. Though this connection was not always immediately or correctly understood at the time, reading occupied a genuinely significant place in Rosalind's private life. More significant, I think, than most modern imaginings of the idle Victorian lady tend to allow for. She reads widely, novels certainly, the great serialized works of the period, arriving in monthly installments, that she and half of literate England waited for with real anticipation, but also history, and periodicals covering everything from foreign affairs to the latest scientific discoveries being debated in the learned societies of the day. Charles Darwin's ideas, decades old by this point, but still very much alive in drawing-room conversation, come up occasionally at her dinner table, discussed with a mixture of genuine intellectual curiosity and lingering theological unease that characterized how many educated people of the era were still working through what evolutionary theory meant for their understanding of creation and their own place within it. She particularly admires George Eliot, whose novels she has read multiple times each, finding in them a depth of psychological observation and moral seriousness that she rarely encounters in her own daily life of calls and dinners and careful social calculation. And there is a passage from Middlemarch she has returned to more than once, about a woman looking out a window at a world that continues regardless of her own particular sorrows or joys, that she finds herself thinking about at odd moments, on quiet afternoons like the one she spent by the window in Harrogate, though she has never quite been able to say to anyone, even herself in so many words, exactly why that particular passage stays with her the way it does. I think it is worth naming here some of the women whose lives ran alongside Rosalind's in this same decade, and pushed hard against the boundaries her own life largely accepted, without much visible struggle, because their existence is part of the honest, complete picture of what Victorian England actually was, not simply the drawing rooms, but the drawing rooms alongside the exceptions to them. Josephine Butler spent these very years campaigning, at real personal cost to her own reputation, against laws that subjected women suspected of prostitution to compulsory and invasive medical examination, while leaving the men who used their services entirely untouched by the law, a campaign that succeeded, eventually, in getting those laws repealed. Millicent Fawcett, still building the organised campaign for women's suffrage that would take decades more to succeed, was already, in these years, a serious and persistent public voice, arguing that women deserved a formal political voice in the country whose laws governed every aspect of their lives without their consent. Annie Besant, a genuinely radical figure by the standards of polite society, was organising among women workers in ways that would have scandalised most of the guests at Rosalind's dinner table, most famously supporting the match girls, whose strike against dangerous working conditions in a London match factory would become, within a few years, one of the defining labour actions of the era. Rosalind never met any of these women personally, moved in circles that barely overlapped with theirs at all, and would likely have found their politics genuinely alarming if pressed to discuss them directly at her own dinner table. And yet I find something quietly moving in imagining the two worlds existing simultaneously, the same London, the same decade, the same fundamental unfairness in how the law and society treated women of every class, producing on one hand a life of silk and sapphires, managed with exquisite, invisible skill within a cage nobody called a cage, and on the other hand a small, determined, unglamorous movement of women willing to be called radical, willing to risk their own respectability and safety, working toward a future where women like Rosalind's own daughter Margaret might eventually inherit choices her mother never had, Neither woman, Rosalind in her drawing room or Butler on her public platform, would have recognized how connected their stories actually were, both pressing, in entirely different registers, against the same walls. Let us return to Grosvenor Square, to an ordinary evening some weeks after the dinner party we sat through together earlier, because I want to close this out gently, the way these evenings ought to close. It is late April now, the season just beginning its slow build toward the full frantic pace of May and June, and tonight there are no guests at all, just the family, just Rosalind and her husband, and, for once, both children permitted to join the adult table for a simple family dinner, a small departure from the usual rigid separation that happens perhaps once a fortnight, and that Rosalind privately treasures more than almost any grander occasion the calendar offers her. Edward, 7 years old and full of an energy that formal Victorian dining does its considerable best to suppress without ever quite succeeding, tells a long and only partially coherent story about something that happened during his lesson with Miss Whitfield, involving, as far as anyone can quite follow, a globe, a misunderstanding about the location of Australia, and a considerable amount of what he insists was entirely justified indignation on his part. Margaret, 4, mostly watches her brother with the particular rapt attention younger siblings reserve for older ones, occasionally offering a comment so quietly it has to be repeated twice before anyone at the table quite catches it, and the Earl, who spends most formal dinners discussing matters considerably weightier than misplaced continents, laughs, genuinely, in a way Rosalind has not heard from him in weeks. This is the version of the house that rarely makes it into the paintings or the guidebooks. A family simply eating together, no seating plan to calculate, no precedents to observe, no guest whose recent widowhood requires a carefully calibrated warmth in her greeting. Just 4 people and a plain roast chicken, considerably simpler than anything the kitchen produces for a real dinner party, because on nights like this even the cook, I think, quietly enjoys the rest. Nora is not required until later and spends the early part of the evening below stairs with the rest of the staff, an unusual small pocket of free time that the household falls into perhaps once a week when the family's evening requires no elaborate dressing, no formal choreography, nothing beyond simply being present with one another. I mention this because I think it matters to the larger honest picture we have been building tonight. It would be easy, having spent this long walking through corsets and sapphires and 9-course dinners and the enormous unequal machinery required to sustain them, to imagine Rosalind's life as nothing but performance, every moment calculated, every gesture managed for effect. That would not be entirely true, and I do not want to leave you with something less than the truth. There were evenings like this one, ordinary, warm, genuinely unguarded, when the wealth that structured almost everything else about her existence simply receded into the background, and what was left was a mother laughing at her son's confused geography, a husband glad to be home, a daughter watching them both with quiet, careful attention, the way children do when they are learning, without anyone teaching them directly, what a family is actually supposed to feel like. After dinner, the children are taken up to the nursery by the nursery maid, a small ritual of good nights that Rosalind performs herself rather than delegating, sitting on the edge of Margaret's bed for a few minutes in the lamplight, listening to a small, half-invented story her daughter tells about a rabbit who lives, apparently somewhere behind the nursery wallpaper, before kissing her goodnight and moving to Edward's room, where the conversation is briefer, more practical, 7-year-old boys generally preferring efficiency to sentiment at bedtime, though he does, at the last moment, ask her to leave the door open a crack, the way he has asked every night since he was small enough to be frightened of the dark, and she does, the way she always has. Downstairs again, the house settling into its evening quiet, Rosalind and her husband sit together in the drawing room for an hour before retiring. No guests, no performance, simply 2 people who have known each other for 11 years occupying the same warm room at the end of an ordinary day. He reads. She plays the piano quietly, not the practiced showpiece she might perform for an audience, but something slower, something she is still learning, working through a difficult passage 3 or 4 times until her fingers begin to find it more naturally, and he looks up from his book once or twice, not to comment, simply to watch her for a moment before returning to his page, a small, unremarkable gesture of attention that neither of them would think to mention afterward, and that meant in its own quiet way considerably more than most of the grand performances the season demanded of them both. Let us move forward a little in time, because I think the shape of a whole life tells you something a single day, however carefully examined, cannot quite capture on its own. 10 years from the evening we have mostly spent inside tonight, Rosalind is 44. Edward is at Cambridge now, having come through Eton in the ordinary way expected of him, tall and a little distant in the manner of young men who have spent their formative years largely away from home in institutions designed to produce exactly that particular kind of confident distance. He writes home dutifully but briefly, and Rosalind, reading his letters, sometimes finds herself missing the small boy who told confused stories about misplaced continents at the family dinner table, a version of her son who exists now only in memory, replaced by a young man she loves just as fiercely, but understands somewhat less completely than she once did. Margaret, at 14, is approaching the age when her own presentation and eventual entry into society will begin to occupy the household's planning in earnest, and Rosalind finds herself watching her daughter grow into the particular poise the role will require of her, thinking often and with real complexity about what she wants for this girl, wants her to have the choices Rosalind herself never quite had, wants her also to be safe and comfortable and well regarded within a world Rosalind knows, from 30 years of lived experience, can be genuinely unkind to a woman who steps too far outside its expectations. These two wants sit uneasily together, and Rosalind has not resolved them, has perhaps stopped expecting to resolve them, and simply holds both, the way most thoughtful parents across most of history have held contradictory hopes for their children, without ever quite managing to reconcile them into something simple. The household itself has changed in smaller ways across this decade too. Nora is still with her, though her role has shifted somewhat, more senior now, training a younger maid in the particular skills Rosalind's toilette requires, passing down the same knowledge of hairpins and hot irons, and the correct pressure for lacing a corset that she herself learnt from an older maid when she first entered service at 17. The old dowager countess who received Rosalind so memorably in that overheated drawing-room years ago has since died, a death that required the entire family to move immediately into deep mourning. Black crepe pulled from the wardrobe kept ready for exactly this purpose, and Rosalind found herself, at the funeral, genuinely moved in a way she had not entirely expected, remembering the old woman's relish for gossip, her particular way of discussing other people's misfortunes with a warmth that somehow never curdled into genuine cruelty, and thinking, with the specific clarity grief sometimes brings, about how many small ordinary hours make up a whole life, how few of them anyone remembers to properly value while they are still happening. There is a particular quality to how wealth like this ages across a lifetime that is worth naming honestly before we come back, finally, to where we started. The season Rosalind attends at 44 looks, on the surface, remarkably similar to the one she attended at 23, the same round of dinners and balls and calls, the same rhythms of dressing and undressing, the same careful arithmetic of precedence and obligation. But underneath that surface continuity, the ground has been shifting, slowly, in ways that would have been difficult to see clearly from inside any single year, but become unmistakable across a decade or two. The agricultural depression that quietly worried the estate managers back in 1881 has deepened considerably, and Camborne Hall's rental income from its tenant farms has fallen by nearly a third across this period, a decline the family has absorbed without any visible change to the London season's expenditure, because appearing to economise, in this world, was often considered more dangerous to a family's standing than the actual underlying financial strain itself, a strange inverted logic that led more than one great family, across these decades, to keep spending at the old level right up until the moment they genuinely could not anymore. New money continues arriving at exactly the dinners and balls Rosalind attends, industrial fortunes and, increasingly, American fortunes, wealthy families from New York and Chicago sending daughters across the Atlantic in search of the titles their own considerable money could not manufacture at home, marriages negotiated with a frankness about finances that would have scandalized an earlier generation, but that, by this point in the century, had become simply another accepted mechanism by which the old aristocracy kept its houses standing and its balls funded. Rosalind has watched several of these matches unfold among families she knows and holds no particular judgment about them, having lived long enough inside this world to understand that the romantic ideal of marriage for love alone was never really the operating principle for people in her position, whatever the novels she loves so much might suggest was possible for people luckier, or perhaps simply less encumbered by fortune than herself. We have spent nearly this whole evening inside Rosalind's world, and I think that is right, because it is the world history tends to leave out or flatten into decoration, but it is worth a few minutes understanding what her husband's parallel life actually looked like too, if only because the contrast tells you something about how differently this same wealth operated, depending on which side of the household you were born into. The Earl's mournings, unlike Rosalind's, involve no elaborate toilette beyond a straightforward shave performed by his valet and a plain dark suit for the morning, considerably simpler than his evening dress, because a gentleman's day clothes carried nowhere near the same weight of social signalling that a lady's did. He breakfasts separately, often earlier, reading the newspaper with an attention Rosalind rarely has leisure to give her own reading until much later in the day, and by 10 he is gone, to his club first, White's or Brooks's depending on the political leanings that had, generations ago, sorted London's gentlemen's clubs into their particular loose factions, and then, on days Parliament sits, to the House of Lords, where his attendance is dutiful rather than especially active, a hereditary seat occupied more from obligation than from any burning legislative ambition. His actual work, in the sense of anything resembling active daily labour, is considerably lighter than Rosalind's, a fact that would have surprised nobody in this household, and struck almost no one in their social circle as remarkable, because a gentleman of his class was not expected to labour in any visible sense at all, his position secured entirely by birth and land, rather than by anything he personally produced or managed day to day. He does attend to the estate's business, meetings with his land agent, correspondence regarding the railway shares that form an increasing portion of the family's actual income as land rents decline, occasional consultation with the family solicitor regarding various legal matters, but this work occupies perhaps 2 or 3 hours of an average day, considerably less than the continuous, invisible management Rosalind performs, simply to keep both households running at the standard his position requires. The rest of his day, more often than not, is leisure in a form considerably less structured than his wife's: cards at the club, conversation, occasionally a ride in the park at the fashionable hour, when being seen on a good horse mattered nearly as much to a gentleman's standing as being seen in a good carriage mattered to a lady's. I do not say this to suggest his life was empty or without its own genuine pressures. The weight of maintaining a title and an estate across generations carried real anxiety of its own, particularly as the economic ground continued shifting beneath families like his throughout these decades. But the specific texture of his day, its comparative looseness, its lack of the minute-by-minute performance and calculation Rosalind's day required from the moment Nora first knocked at her door, tells you something true about how unevenly even this shared enormous privilege was actually distributed between a husband and a wife who on paper occupied exactly the same extraordinary rung of English society. A wine cellar at Grosvenor Square deserves its own moment, tucked below the kitchen, cool and dim and maintained with an attention nearly equal to the jewellery safe upstairs, because a household's wine cellar was, in its own quiet way, another form of visible wealth, even if most guests never actually descended to see it directly. Several hundred bottles at any given time, claret and port laid down years earlier and left to age properly, champagne kept for immediate use rather than aging, sherry and Madeira for the smaller everyday occasions, the whole collection managed by the butler with a expertise that took years to properly develop, knowing which bottles were nearing their peak, which needed another decade in the dark before they were ready, which merchant in the city could be trusted for a genuine vintage, and which had, on more than one occasion across the trade's long history, been caught selling adulterated or mislabeled wine to households too polite or too unfamiliar with the actual product to notice the difference. A single case of a genuinely fine vintage claret might run to £4 or £5, and the cellar as a whole, valued in total, represented an investment worth several £100, sitting quietly in the dark, waiting to be poured, glass by glass, into conversations that would rarely, if ever, include any mention of what exactly was being drunk, or what it had cost to have it ready at exactly this moment of readiness. Upstairs, the library, on the floor above the dining room, held its own kind of wealth too. Several thousand volumes accumulated across generations of the family, leather-bound sets of the classics that the Earl's grandfather had commissioned specifically for their appearance, as much as their content, alongside a genuinely working collection of contemporary literature, history and periodicals that both Rosalind and her husband actually used, though their reading habits diverged considerably, his running toward history and biography, hers toward the novels and essays that occupied her quieter hours. A handful of paintings hung throughout the house, nothing on the scale of a great national collection but genuinely valuable pieces nonetheless. A landscape by a reasonably well-regarded contemporary artist, purchased at considerable expense, specifically to be displayed in the drawing room, where dinner guests would see it and understand, without anyone needing to say so directly, exactly what kind of family they were dining with. And beneath all of this, quietly, sat the broader economic reality of an empire that made a great deal of this luxury possible in the first place. The tea in Rosalind's afternoon service arriving from plantations in India and Ceylon, worked by labourers whose wages and conditions she never once had cause to think about. The sugar in the confectioner's spun swan travelling from Caribbean plantations whose own long history of exploitation only recently emerged from outright slavery within living memory of some of the guests at her table, remained almost entirely unspoken in the drawing rooms where its products were so casually, so beautifully consumed. The reach of this single household's daily luxury extended, in other words, considerably further than Grosvenor Square, further than Devonshire, out across an empire whose labour, in one form or another, quietly subsidised nearly everything on Rosalind's table without ever once being visible there. It is worth understanding, too, just how unusual a household like the Cambornes actually was, even within a century famous, in retrospect, for its stark inequality. Domestic service was, by the 1880s, the single largest category of employment for women in England, over 1 million women across the country working in service of one kind or another, but the overwhelming majority of them worked not in grand establishments like Grosvenor Square with its 11 indoor servants, but in considerably smaller households, a single maid of all work employed by a modest middle-class family, doing every task from cooking to cleaning to childcare essentially alone, for wages lower even than what Nora earned as a specialised lady's maid, and with none of the internal hierarchy and support that a large staff like the Cambornes provided its own servants, however imperfect that support might have been. A household the size and grandeur of the Cambornes represented, in real terms, perhaps the top few hundred families in the entire country, a genuinely tiny fraction of English society commanding a genuinely enormous share of its wealth, land and social influence. Estimates from economic historians looking back at this period suggest the very wealthiest slice of English society, families like the Cambornes among them, held a share of the nation's total wealth that would strike a modern audience as almost unbelievable, a concentration at the top considerably more extreme than most developed nations would consider acceptable or even stable today. And this concentration was not merely a matter of comfortable living, it was, as we have spent this whole evening detailing, a matter of an entirely separate material reality, different food, different medicine, different education, different legal standing in some respects, a genuinely different experience of being alive in the same city, the same country, the same decade, as the vast majority of the people whose labour, directly or indirectly, made that different reality possible. Nora, watching all of this from her particular vantage point within the household, closer to it than almost anyone outside the family itself, and yet permanently excluded from ever truly belonging to it, will eventually leave service, some years from the evening we have mostly spent inside tonight, to marry a shopkeeper she meets through her sister, a match that Rosalind, genuinely fond of her after so many years of the most intimate daily proximity two people from such different worlds could share, helps along with a small wedding gift and a letter of reference so warm it borders on affectionate, the kind of document that would in fact help Nora and her husband considerably as they establish their own small business in the years that follow. It is, in its modest way, a genuinely happy ending, though not one either woman would have described using such dramatic language. Simply the quiet, unremarkable conclusion of one particular working life that had spent nearly 2 decades pressed up close against extraordinary wealth without ever once, itself, becoming part of it. Let me try, before we close, to actually translate some of tonight's numbers into something your own mind can hold on to properly. Because pounds and shillings from 1881 can feel abstract, almost like play money, until you convert them into something closer to today's terms. Economic historians who study this kind of conversion generally suggest that a pound in this period carried purchasing power somewhere in the range of 100 to 130 times its nominal value in contemporary money, though the comparison always gets complicated by how differently people spent their money then versus now, how much cheaper labour was relative to manufactured goods, how much more expensive certain imported luxuries were relative to today's globalised supply chains. But even a rough conversion gives you something to actually feel. That single dinner party, costing something around £40, translates to something in the neighbourhood of £4,000 to £5,000 in contemporary terms, spent on one evening's food and flowers and hired help. Rosalind's annual clothing budget, at the higher end we discussed, £1,500, translates to something approaching £150,000 spent purely on dress in a single year. The household's total annual running costs, that £8,000 to £10,000 we mentioned earlier, would sit somewhere near £1 million a year in contemporary terms, an entire household budget larger than many people's home purchases, spent simply maintaining 2 residences and the small army of people required to keep them functioning. And against all of that, Nora's £22 a year translates to something in the range of £2,000 to £3,000 annually in contemporary money, an amount that, converted honestly, would strike almost anyone today as an impossible sum to actually live on, let alone save toward any kind of independent future. This is, I think, the number that lands hardest whenever I sit with this material properly. Not the sapphires, not the spun sugar swan. The simple fact that a woman working 16 or 17 hours a day, 6 days a week, with genuine skill and genuine dedication, earned across an entire year roughly what her mistress spent on a single, fairly ordinary dinner party for 18 people who mostly forgot what they ate by the following week. This is what filthy rich actually meant once you translate it out of costume drama and into arithmetic. Not simply comfortable, not simply well provided for. A distance so vast between one life and the life of the person lacing your corset each morning that the two of you might as well have been living in entirely different centuries, sharing nothing but a roof, a staircase, and an unspoken agreement, held in place by law, custom, and the sheer accumulated weight of how things had always been done, that this arrangement was simply the natural order of the world, requiring no explanation and inviting no serious question from either side of it. Let me give you one more full scene before we let the evening rest properly, because I think it draws several of tonight's threads together in a single vivid picture, and it happens to be one of the most expensive single days in the entire social calendar of a family like the Cambornes. A society wedding. Rosalind attends several every season, but the one I want to describe took place 2 years after our original November evening, when the daughter of a close friend married into another old landed family, a match considered, by everyone whose opinion mattered in this particular world, an excellent one, joining 2 estates and 2 fortunes in exactly the kind of alliance the entire architecture of the season existed to eventually produce. The wedding itself was held at a fashionable church in Mayfair, the bride arriving in a gown that had taken the dressmaker nearly 2 months to complete. Ivory silk with a train extending some 15 feet behind her, carried by 2 small pages dressed for the occasion in miniature velvet suits that would never be worn again after this single afternoon. The gown alone cost something over £200, a sum that considerably exceeded what most working families in England would see across 2 or 3 entire years of combined household income, worn for a ceremony lasting perhaps 40 minutes before being carefully packed away. The veil alone, a genuine Brussels lace many decades old, and passed down through the bride's family for 3 generations, insured separately from the gown itself at a value that made the church's rector, by his own later account, faintly nervous simply having it in his building. A wedding breakfast that followed, held at the bride's family home rather than the church itself, was its own enormous production. Several hundred guests moving through reception rooms, opened up specifically for the occasion, an elaborate cold buffet supplemented by hot dishes kept warming in a temporary kitchen setup constructed specifically for the day, champagne flowing continuously from the moment guests arrived until the final toast some hours later, and at the center of it all, a wedding cake that stood, by several contemporary accounts, over 6 feet tall, tiered and iced in white sugar work that had taken the confectioner and 2 assistants nearly a full week to complete, decorated with sugar flowers, so precisely rendered that more than one guest reportedly reached out to touch a rose before realizing it was not, in fact, real. Total cost of the wedding, church, gown, breakfast, cake, flowers, the temporary staff hired to manage several hundred guests, the fireworks display that closed the evening once darkness fell over the garden, ran to something in the neighbourhood of £2,000, a single day's expenditure equivalent to roughly 20 years of a housemaid's entire wages, spent on an event that, however genuinely joyful for the 2 families involved, existed as much to publicly announce the successful joining of 2 fortunes and 2 bloodlines, as it did to celebrate the particular affection between the 2 young people actually getting married, an affection which, by all accounts, was real and mutual, which somehow made the whole enormous, elaborate machinery surrounding it feel simultaneously moving and slightly beside the point. The newlyweds departed the next morning for a honeymoon on the continent, a custom that had become firmly established among wealthy English couples by this point in the century, typically several weeks travelling through France, Switzerland and Italy, staying in the same circuit of grand hotels that Rosalind and her own husband had travelled through at the start of their marriage. The cost of a honeymoon of this kind, private railway compartments, the finest hotel suites available in each city, a considerable wardrobe purchased specifically for the trip since a bride's trousseau was itself its own significant category of expense, ran to several hundred additional pounds on top of everything already spent on the wedding itself, and yet none of this struck anyone in either family as remotely excessive, because within this particular closed economic world, expenditure at this scale simply was what marriage at this level of society cost. An unquestioned baseline rather than a luxury requiring any particular justification. I keep circling back, across this whole evening, to that word, unquestioned, because I think it is genuinely the key to understanding this entire world properly. It was not that Rosalind or her friends, or the newlyweds we just watched marry, were unusually greedy or unusually oblivious people, more so than anyone else across history who has found themselves born into extraordinary circumstance. It was that the entire structure around them, the law, the etiquette manuals, the church, the newspapers that reported approvingly on exactly this kind of lavish wedding, the very language available to them for describing their own lives, offered almost no vocabulary, no framework, no genuine occasion for questioning whether any of it was fair, or necessary, or sustainable. The questioning, when it came from outside that world almost entirely, from women like Josephine Butler and Annie Besant, from journalists investigating the sweated trades, from the slow accumulating pressure of reform movements that would take decades to bear fruit, and from economic forces, agricultural depression, industrial competition, that would eventually, within a few decades of the wedding we just described, begin dismantling the foundations of this particular world, whether anyone living inside it had questioned it or not. Let us slow down now, properly, because it is late, and I want to bring you back, gently, to the particular texture of an ordinary night in this world, before we finish the small, unremarkable rituals that closed almost every one of Rosalind's days, regardless of whether that day had held a 9-course dinner for 18, or nothing more than letters and a quiet hour at the piano. Whatever the evening had held, it ended, always, in roughly the same way. Nora unlacing what the morning had laced, the corset loosened stay by stay, the sound reversing itself, that same dry creak of whalebone easing rather than tightening, a sound Rosalind had heard so many thousands of times across her adult life that she barely registered it at all anymore. The way you stop hearing a clock ticking in a room you have lived in for years. The heavy silk of whatever gown the evening had required came off next, hung carefully on its padded form, smoothed and checked for any mark or stain that would need attention before it could be worn again. The jewels, whatever they had been that night, sapphires or pearls or the simpler garnets kept for quieter occasions, returned to their case, and the case returned to its hidden safe, the small ceremonial click of the lock turning one of the last sounds of Rosalind's day. Her hair came down, pin by pin, 30 of them removed and set carefully into a small dish on the dressing table, the elaborate structure of curls and pads unwound until it was simply hair again, brushed out in long, slow strokes, the same boar bristle brush from the morning now working in the opposite direction, easing rather than building. And this part, more than almost any other in her entire day, Rosalind genuinely loved, the rhythmic pull of the brush, 100 strokes counted quietly by Nora under her breath, a small private ritual between the two women that neither had ever discussed as meaningful, and both, in their own way, clearly valued. Cold cream again, worked gently into skin that had spent the whole evening under gaslight and candlelight and the close warm air of a crowded dining room. The same rosewater and glycerin from the morning now closing the day the way it had opened it, a kind of quiet symmetry that Rosalind had never consciously noticed but that had shaped the rhythm of her entire adult life without her ever once needing to think about it directly. A nightgown, plain cotton or fine linen depending on the season, replaced the heavy structured silk of the evening, and the sudden lightness of it, the simple unencumbered drape of a garment that required no corset, no petticoats, no careful arrangement at all, was its own small daily pleasure, arriving at the very end of a day that had otherwise been almost entirely about structure, presentation and careful, continuous management. The house falls asleep in layers, if you think about it properly, each floor settling at its own particular hour, according to its own particular labour. The nursery goes quiet first, usually, children's bedtimes fixed and early regardless of what the adults below are doing. Edward and Margaret both long asleep by the time their mother has even sat down to a formal dinner most evenings. The kitchen, paradoxically, is often the last room on the lower floors to fully quiet, the scullery maid finishing the last of the washing up sometimes past midnight after a large dinner, her hands raw from hot water and strong soap, working alone in a kitchen lit by a single lamp, while the rest of the house has long since moved into darkness above her. The servants' rooms under the roof settle by 1 or 2 in the morning at the latest, exhausted bodies finding sleep quickly regardless of the thin mattresses and the sometimes considerable cold, because 17 hours of continuous physical labour tends to produce a sleep that requires very little coaxing. And Rosalind's own room, at the centre of it all, geographically and in some ways symbolically, settles last of the family's rooms but well before the kitchen below her. The candles finally extinguished, the window cracked slightly for the fresh air the health manuals of the period recommended so insistently, the fire in the small bedroom grate banked down to embers that will need building up again before 6 the next morning by whichever housemaid draws that particular task. She lies in the dark for a few minutes most nights before sleep actually arrives, and this, I think, is worth imagining honestly, because it is the one part of her entire day that belongs to absolutely no one else. No husband, no children, no servant, no guest, simply her own mind in the dark, running back over whatever the day had held, whatever small triumph or small anxiety the evening's dinner or the afternoon's calls had produced, before it finally, gently, lets go. What does she think about in those few private minutes? I cannot tell you with certainty, because no diary of Rosalind survives, because Rosalind herself is, as I mentioned near the beginning of tonight, a composite built from the genuine diaries and letters and household accounts of women who did leave a record, stitched together into a single life I hope has felt real to you across this evening, even though it belongs to no one specific woman in particular. But the women whose actual words survive from this period, the real letters, the real diaries kept by women of exactly Rosalind's class and circumstance, suggest something remarkably consistent across dozens of different individual lives, a kind of low, persistent hum of tiredness that rarely rises to complaint, alongside genuine moments of real pleasure, real love for their children, and often, though not always, genuine affection for their husbands, and underneath both of those things, occasionally surfacing in a diary entry late at night much like this one, a quiet, half-formed question about what all of it, the silk and the sapphires, and the continuous careful performance, was actually building toward, a question most of these women seem to have set down again quickly, unanswered, and returned to their pillow, because morning and Nora's knock at the door, and the next long day of it, was never very far away. It is worth noticing too what survives from a life like this one, and what does not, because the asymmetry tells its own quiet story. Rosalind's portrait, had she been a real woman rather than the composite we have built together tonight, would very likely still exist somewhere, hung perhaps in a private collection, catalogued in some family archive, her face preserved in oil paint for as long as the canvas itself survives, composed and remote in exactly the way I described at the very start of this evening. Her jewels, if not sold or broken up across generations, might still exist too, passed down or eventually auctioned, appearing perhaps in some specialist sale catalogue, with a description noting their provenance, their approximate date, their connection to a family whose name a modern buyer might recognize from a stately home now open to paying tourists on weekend afternoons. Her letters, if her family valued them enough to keep them, might sit in an archive somewhere, available to historians exactly like the ones whose research made an evening like tonight's even possible to construct with any real accuracy. Nora leaves almost nothing. No portrait was ever commissioned, no letters were kept, beyond perhaps the reference letter Rosalind wrote her, which may or may not have survived the ordinary attrition of decades in a family's private papers, more likely lost than kept, because nobody thought a lady's maid's reference letter was the kind of document worth preserving for posterity. If Nora is remembered at all, historically, it is only in the aggregate, one line in a wage book, one entry in a census return listing her occupation and her age, and very little else, one anonymous figure among the roughly 1 million women in domestic service across England in this decade, whose individual lives, individual thoughts, individual small joys and griefs, mostly vanished from the record entirely within a generation or two of their deaths, leaving historians to reconstruct their experience the way I have tried to do tonight, through inference, through comparison, through the occasional surviving fragment, rather than through anything resembling a direct, personal, first-hand account. This asymmetry, I think, is worth sitting with honestly rather than resolving too neatly. It is not simply that Rosalind's life was more interesting or more worth remembering than Nora's. It is that the systems of memory itself, who gets painted, who gets archived, whose letters get kept, were shaped by exactly the same inequality that shaped everything else we discussed tonight, and the historical record we inherit today, filled as it is with paintings of women like Rosalind and almost silent on women like Nora, is itself a kind of continuation of the original unfairness, extended forward across a century and a half, still quietly determining, even now, whose story gets told in detail, and whose gets reduced to a number on a page. Let me widen the lens for a moment before we come back finally to a close, because I think the broader historical picture helps this single household make more sense. Queen Victoria had been on the throne since 1837, by the year we have mostly spent inside tonight, already more than 4 decades into a reign that would eventually stretch past 60 years, the longest in English history to that point, and the country over which she reigned was, by the 1880s, at something close to the peak of its global reach, an empire that spanned roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed, in one form or another, something approaching a quarter of the world's population. London itself was, by most contemporary measures, the largest and wealthiest city on Earth, a genuine imperial capital through which flowed goods, capital, and people from every corner of a global trading network that Britain had spent the better part of 2 centuries building, often through methods, colonization, forced labor, and outright military conquest that a modern audience would rightly judge with considerably more moral clarity than most of Rosalind's contemporaries ever brought to bear on the subject. Alongside this imperial wealth, and alongside households like the Cambornes, England in this same decade contained genuinely staggering poverty, a fact that even contemporary observers, including some from within Rosalind's own social class, were beginning to document with real, sometimes shocking, specificity. Charles Booth would soon begin his enormous survey of London poverty, eventually mapping street by street the conditions in which the city's poorest residents actually lived, work that revealed, to a reading public largely unfamiliar with conditions outside their own neighbourhoods, the sheer scale of deprivation existing sometimes mere streets away from the grandest Mayfair addresses, overcrowded tenement housing, chronic malnutrition among working families, infant mortality rates in the poorest districts running many times higher than in wealthy neighbourhoods like Rosalind's own, children working from genuinely young ages in factories and workshops under conditions that reformers had only partially succeeded in regulating through decades of legislative struggle. The same city that hosted Rosalind's 9-course dinners hosted, within walking distance in some cases, families of 6 or 8 sharing a single room, children who had never in their lives eaten a meal resembling anything on Rosalind's table, women working 60 or 70 hours a week in conditions that made Nora's demanding 17-hour days look, by comparison, almost comfortable. I raise this not to diminish anything we have discussed tonight about Rosalind's own life, which had its genuine constraints and genuine costs even within its extraordinary privilege, but because I think an honest evening spent inside Victorian wealth has to hold the full width of the century in view, the empire and the poverty and the wealth all existing simultaneously, all connected by threads of labour and capital that most people living inside any single part of that picture rarely saw stretching all the way across it. Fashion itself moved through several genuinely distinct phases across the decades that framed Rosalind's adult life, and it is worth understanding this movement because the silhouette a wealthy Victorian woman wore was never static the way costume dramas sometimes suggest, collapsing 40 years of change into a single generic look. In the 1860s, when Rosalind was still a child, the fashionable silhouette had been the enormous crinoline, a cage-like structure of steel hoops that could extend a skirt to a genuinely startling width, 6 feet across at its most extreme, a fashion that produced its own particular hazards, women occasionally catching fire when a crinoline swept too close to an open hearth, the wide steel structure making it difficult to move quickly enough to escape the flames, a danger serious enough that it was documented with some regularity in period newspapers, and eventually became one of the reasons the fashion began falling from favour. By the time we joined Rosalind for the dinner party earlier this evening, the crinoline had given way to the bustle, a structure that pushed volume toward the back of the skirt rather than distributing it in a wide circle, creating the particular silhouette, the pronounced curve at the back, the closer fitted front, that would have been immediately recognisable to anyone in her social circle as thoroughly current and fashionable. This particular style of bustle would itself fall from fashion by the later part of the decade, replaced briefly by a slimmer silhouette before an even more dramatic, exaggerated bustle returned in the mid-1880s, fashion moving in these genuine, documented waves across the century rather than sitting still in the single unchanging image many people carry of it. Rosalind, like most fashionable women of real means, adjusted her wardrobe continuously to track these shifts, which is itself part of why the annual clothing budget we discussed earlier ran so high, not simply the cost of individual garments but the ongoing cost of staying visibly, correctly current within a silhouette that genuinely changed, sometimes considerably, every few years. The aesthetic movement, meanwhile, was quietly gaining ground among a smaller, more artistically inclined slice of wealthy society during exactly these years. Women who favoured looser, more flowing garments inspired by medieval and classical dress, rejecting the rigid corsetry and structured silhouette of mainstream fashion in favour of something its advocates considered more natural, more artistic, and considerably more comfortable. A genuine countercurrent within the same decade, even if it remained, for most of the 1880s, a minority taste confined mostly to artistic and intellectual circles rather than the broader fashionable mainstream that Rosalind herself moved through. Technology was quietly transforming household life during exactly this decade too, in ways that a household like the Cambornes experienced considerably earlier than most of the country. Gas lighting had been standard in wealthy London homes for decades by this point, replacing the candles and oil lamps of an earlier generation, though candles remained in use for the most formal occasions, dinner parties especially, because gaslight, however convenient, was considered somewhat harsh and unflattering for evening entertaining compared to the softer, more forgiving glow of candlelight. a genuinely practical aesthetic judgment that kept candle merchants in steady business among wealthy households long after gas had become the everyday standard for ordinary household lighting. Electric lighting was still, in the early 1880s, a genuine novelty, installed in only a handful of the wealthiest and most technologically adventurous London homes, and Rosalind's own household would not convert to electric light for another decade or more, watching with interest as friends who had made the change reported on its brightness, its cleanliness compared to gas, which left a faint residue of soot on ceilings and curtains over time, and its occasional, still somewhat unreliable tendency to simply fail without warning. The telephone similarly existed by this point, but remained a genuine rarity even among wealthy households, London's telephone exchange still small and its usefulness limited by how few other households or businesses were connected to it, meaning that for most practical purposes, the elaborate system of letters, calling cards and personal visits that structured Rosalind's entire social world remained the primary technology of communication throughout this decade, a system that would not be meaningfully displaced until considerably later in the century and into the next one. Photography, as I mentioned regarding Rosalind's honeymoon album, had become considerably more accessible than in its earliest, most expensive decades, though a proper studio portrait still represented a genuine expense and a formal occasion. Families dressing carefully and sitting with considerable stillness for the several seconds of exposure early photographic technology still required, producing images that, unlike the casual, constant photography of a much later century, were rare enough that each one carried real weight and real intention behind it. Charitable work occupied a specific, formalized place in Rosalind's calendar too, distinct from the general goodwill of Christmas bonuses to her own staff. She sat on the committee of a hospital charity that organized an annual fundraising bazaar, an event considerably smaller in scale than a proper ball, but still requiring weeks of preparation, wealthy women of the neighborhood contributing needlework, preserves, and small handmade items to be sold at stalls, staffed by the committee members themselves, the proceeds going toward the hospital's operating costs in an era before any organized system of public health funding existed to support such institutions. The bazaar raised, in a good year, perhaps £200 or £300, a genuinely useful sum for the hospital, though considerably less than the household spent on a single season's wardrobe, a discrepancy that occasionally, in Rosalind's more reflective moments, struck her as worth noticing, though never quite worth restructuring her own spending to address in any serious way. There is one more small anecdote I want to share before we let this evening rest, because I think it captures, in miniature, almost everything we have discussed tonight. At a ball 2 seasons after our original November dinner, a minor scandal rippled through the room when a young woman, recently arrived from a wealthy but distinctly new money family, appeared wearing a diamond necklace that several of the older guests recognized, or believed they recognized, as considerably more valuable than anything a family of her particular background, however wealthy, ought reasonably to be displaying at a first-season ball. The whispered conversation that followed her around the room for the remainder of the evening concerned itself almost entirely with whether the diamonds were genuine or paste, whether her father's fortune, made in some form of manufacturing that nobody present could quite specify with confidence, actually justified jewelry of this apparent scale, and what her willingness to wear something so ostentatious, so early in her first season, suggested about her family's understanding, or misunderstanding, of exactly how wealth was supposed to be displayed within these particular rooms. Rosalind, watching this unfold from a comfortable distance, found herself thinking about how strange the whole episode actually was, once you examined it honestly. The old aristocratic families in that ballroom, her own included, possessed wealth built substantially on inherited land and, going back further, on titles and privileges granted centuries earlier by monarchs for reasons that had long since stopped mattering to anyone's actual daily life. The young woman's family had built their fortune within a single working lifetime through manufacturing and genuine entrepreneurial risk, arguably a more directly earned wealth than anything sitting around most of her own ancestors' family trees. And yet it was her diamonds, not the Camborne sapphires or anyone else's inherited jewels, that drew suspicion and quiet mockery, simply because the wealth behind them was too recent, too visible in its origins, too obviously the product of actual labor and enterprise, rather than the comfortable, several generations old accumulation that made old money feel, to people like Rosalind, somehow more legitimate, more tasteful, more properly, invisibly earned. She never mentioned this particular observation to anyone at the ball, or indeed to anyone at all, filing it away instead among the small private thoughts she rarely spoke aloud, the ones that sat somewhat uneasily alongside her genuine comfort within this world. Evidence, if she had ever cared to examine it fully, that some part of her understood perfectly well how arbitrary, how constructed, how genuinely strange the whole elaborate system of rank and taste and belonging she had spent her entire adult life moving through actually was, even as she continued, competently and without any real interruption, to move through it. Let me linger a little longer on food, actually, because I think it deserves more than the single dinner party we walked through earlier, and because the sheer specificity of what wealthy Victorians considered worth eating tells you something genuinely interesting about how taste and status intertwined in this century. Turtle soup, real turtle soup made from an actual imported turtle, rather than the mock version that middle-class households sometimes attempted with a calf's head as a substitute, was considered one of the great luxury dishes of the age. The turtles themselves, shipped alive across the Atlantic from the Caribbean, kept in specialized tanks by London's finest dealers, a single dish costing a genuine small fortune, and served, quite deliberately, at only the grandest occasions, specifically because its rarity and expense were the entire point of serving it at all. Ices and creams occupied their own elaborate category. The ice itself, before mechanical refrigeration became widespread, harvested from frozen lakes and ponds each winter, and stored in deep, straw-insulated ice houses that wealthy estates like Camborne Hall maintained specifically for this purpose, the stored ice lasting, if the ice house was well built and well managed, through most of the following summer, allowing a household like the Cambornes to serve elaborate moulded ice creams and sorbets even in the height of a warm London August, a luxury that depended entirely on the considerable expense of building and maintaining an ice house in the first place. Another small piece of infrastructure, invisible to any dinner guest enjoying the finished dessert. Game occupied a particular place of pride too, not simply because it tasted good, but because access to it signalled land ownership directly. The pheasant and grouse and partridge that appeared on Rosalind's table connected quite literally back to the shooting parties at Camborne Hall, the birds raised and managed specifically for this purpose by gamekeepers whose entire professional existence revolved around ensuring a healthy population of birds for the family and its guests to shoot each autumn. A dinner featuring game, in other words, was never simply a meal, it was a quiet, edible demonstration of exactly how much land the family controlled, and how carefully that land was managed purely for the purpose of producing something that would eventually be shot for sport and served for pleasure, a use of land that a tenant farmer working the surrounding fields for his own family's survival would have found, if he ever thought about it directly, a genuinely strange use of ground that could otherwise have grown considerably more food for considerably more people. Coffee and chocolate, both imported at real expense from distant plantations worked under conditions Rosalind's dinner guests rarely discussed in any detail, rounded out the array of luxury foods that appeared regularly at her table, alongside fruits grown under glass through the coldest months, pineapples and grapes and peaches forced into ripeness by coal fires burning around the clock in specially built hothouses, a luxury so specific and so labor-intensive that a single well-grown pineapple could, as I mentioned earlier, cost more than a servant's monthly wage, admired more often than actually eaten, sliced thin and arranged decoratively on a dessert plate, as much for the visual statement of abundance it made as for any particular pleasure in its taste. There is one more corner of this world worth stepping into before we close, because it touches something we have not quite discussed tonight, the particular position of a woman whose husband has died and who now finds herself, for the first time in her adult life, legally and financially responsible for decisions that would previously have belonged entirely to him. Lady Featherstone, whom you may remember from the dinner party earlier this evening, arriving in violet silk that clashed rather badly with the room's decor, had been widowed some 18 months before that particular dinner, and her situation illustrates something genuinely important about how differently wealth could function depending on the specific legal and marital circumstances a woman found herself in. Her husband's death had left her, under the terms of a marriage settlement negotiated decades earlier by lawyers on both sides of the union, considerably better provided for than many widows of the era, a jointure meaning a fixed annual income guaranteed to her for life regardless of what became of the remainder of the estate, set at £800 a year, along with the right to remain in a smaller property belonging to the family for as long as she wished. This was, by any reasonable measure, a genuinely comfortable income, several times what a professional man might earn, and yet it represented a considerable step down from the household she had run as the wife of a peer, a step down measured not simply in money, but in scope, in the sheer scale of the establishment she now had authority over, 3 servants rather than 11, a modest house rather than a grand one, a life reduced, in its material particulars, even as it remained, by any ordinary standard, extraordinarily comfortable. Not every widow fared so well. Marriage settlements varied enormously depending on the wealth and generosity of the families involved at the time of the original marriage, and a woman whose husband died without having arranged matters carefully, or whose husband's estate turned out to be more encumbered by debt than anyone had realized during his lifetime, could find herself in circumstances considerably more precarious than her married life had ever suggested was possible, dependent on the goodwill of adult children or more distant relations in a way that could feel, for a woman who had spent decades managing a household with real competence and authority, a genuine and humiliating diminishment. Rosalind, watching Lady Featherstone move through her new circumstances with what appeared to be real grace, found herself thinking more than once about how thin the membrane actually was between the security her own married life provided and a version of events, her husband's sudden death, an estate more complicated than it appeared, that could leave her in a position not entirely unlike her widowed friends, a thought she generally allowed herself only briefly before setting it firmly aside, because dwelling on it changed nothing about how the law and the marriage settlement her own father had negotiated on her behalf, at 19, before she had any real say in the matter herself, currently stood. Letters, too, deserve one final honest look, because I mentioned earlier that Rosalind wrote 5 before 11 most mornings, and I want you to understand what an enormous, continuous undertaking correspondence actually represented across a woman's entire adult life in this era, long before telephones or any of the instant communication a modern listener takes entirely for granted. A woman of Rosalind's standing might write and receive dozens of letters a week, each one requiring not simply information but the correct tone, the correct degree of warmth or formality calibrated precisely to the relationship and the occasion. Congratulations on a birth composed with genuine feeling but appropriate restraint, condolences on a death requiring their own careful vocabulary that etiquette manuals of the period actually codified in some detail, invitations extended and declined and accepted in language so ritualized that an experienced hostess like Rosalind could compose the standard versions almost without conscious thought, saving her genuine attention for the more delicate correspondence, a friend in difficulty, a family matter requiring real tact, where the wrong words once sent could not be recalled. This correspondence was not merely social maintenance, though it was certainly that. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the primary instruments through which a woman like Rosalind exercised whatever influence and agency was available to her within a world that offered her no vote, no legal standing over her own property, and no formal role in the political or economic decisions that shaped the nation around her. Through letters, she could advocate for a young relation seeking a position, smooth over a misunderstanding before it became a genuine rupture, maintain the vast web of connection and obligation that determined, in ways both subtle and enormous, which families prospered and which slowly declined in social standing across a generation. It was work performed almost entirely with a pen, in private, credited to no one, and it was, in its cumulative effect across decades, genuinely significant. Childbirth itself deserves a moment of honest attention too, because it sat, for a woman of Rosalind's era, at the genuine intersection of everything wealth could and could not fully protect against. When Margaret was born, 4 years before the dinner party we spent so much of tonight inside, Rosalind's confinement, the period of rest and seclusion expected of a pregnant woman in the final weeks before birth, and for some weeks afterward, was managed with every resource money could summon, a specialist physician engaged months in advance, a monthly nurse retained to live in the house for a full month surrounding the birth itself, the finest linens, the warmest room in the house prepared and kept at a careful constant temperature, and yet childbirth in this century, even for the wealthiest women in England, remained genuinely dangerous, puerperal fever and other complications claiming the lives of women across every social class with a regularity that a modern listener accustomed to childbirth's relative safety would likely find difficult to fully absorb. Rosalind had in fact lost a child between Edward and Margaret, a daughter who lived only a handful of hours, a loss she rarely spoke of directly but that surfaced, occasionally, in small unexpected moments, a particular quality of quiet that would settle over her on a certain date each year that nobody else in the household, save perhaps Nora, who had been with her through all 3 confinements, ever quite understood the significance of. Grief of this specific kind was in this era both extremely common, given the infant and maternal mortality rates of the period, and simultaneously subject to a particular social expectation of restraint. A bereaved mother of Rosalind's class expected to mourn appropriately, in the correct clothing for the correct duration, and then to resume her social obligations without excessive display of a sorrow that, however genuine and however lasting in private, etiquette held was simply not meant to be worn openly for very long in company. I mention this not to darken an evening that has, I hope, mostly carried its weight with some grace and some genuine warmth, but because I think it would be dishonest to leave you with a picture of wealth as a complete shield against the ordinary sorrows of being alive in this century. It bought Rosalind the best care available anywhere in England at the time. It did not buy her certainty or immunity or a guarantee that love and money together could hold back every loss a mother of this era, however fortunate in every other respect, might still be asked to bear. There were quieter entertainments too, scattered through the season alongside the grand dinners and balls, and I think they deserve a moment of attention because they show a slightly gentler side of how this wealth expressed itself. Garden parties, held through the warmer months at houses fortunate enough to have real gardens attached, even in central London, brought together perhaps 80 or 100 guests on a summer afternoon, tea and ices served on the lawn, a small orchestra sometimes engaged to play quietly from a corner of the terrace, croquet available for the younger guests, though Rosalind herself, by her mid-30s, considered herself rather past the age of croquet, preferring instead to move slowly among the guests with a cup of tea, conducting the same continuous, gentle social management that structured almost every gathering she attended, simply in a rather more relaxed key than a formal dinner required. Private views at the Royal Academy's summer exhibition occupied their own particular place on the calendar too, a day before the exhibition formally opened to the wider paying public, when society's most fashionable members were invited to view the year's selected paintings, an occasion that functioned, much like the opera, as considerably more than simple art appreciation. Rosalind genuinely enjoyed painting, had a reasonably informed eye for it, developed over years of exactly these visits, and could discuss the merits of a particular portrait or landscape with real considered opinion rather than mere fashionable enthusiasm. But she was also entirely aware that the private view was, in equal measure, an occasion for being seen in a new spring costume specifically chosen for the purpose, moving slowly through crowded galleries in conversation with exactly the people whose good opinion mattered most to her family's continued standing. The paintings themselves sometimes almost a pretext for an afternoon that was, at its heart, simply one more carefully choreographed opportunity for the season's ongoing performance of who belonged where, in relation to whom. These gentler occasions, the garden party, the private view, the quiet hour at the piano we visited earlier, are worth remembering alongside the grander, more expensive spectacles we spent most of tonight inside, because I think they round out the picture honestly. Rosalind's life was not simply an unbroken sequence of 9-course dinners and elaborate balls, however much those particular occasions have dominated our evening together. It included real pockets of gentler pleasure too, an afternoon on a lawn in June sunlight, a painting that genuinely moved her, a friend's company enjoyed for its own sake rather than its strategic value, small ordinary human satisfactions threaded through even the most elaborately performed life, present in this world exactly as they are present in any other, however different the surrounding architecture happens to look. Let me take you one last time, somewhere we have not properly visited tonight, out past the formal gardens of Camborne Hall, to the farms whose rents quietly fund so much of what we have spent this whole evening describing. The tenant farmers working land the Camborne family has held for generations live lives that would strike Rosalind, if she ever genuinely considered them in any detail, as almost impossibly hard, up before dawn through every season, working fields that depended entirely on weather and luck, and back-breaking physical labour for a livelihood that the ongoing agricultural depression was making steadily more precarious with each passing year. A tenant farmer's wife rose as early as any scullery maid in the London kitchen, managed a dairy or a poultry yard alongside raising children, mended clothes by firelight rather than sending them to a lady's maid for careful pressing, and considered a genuinely good year one in which the harvest covered the rent with something left over, rather than one measured in silk yardage or hothouse pineapples. And yet even here, among the rural poor whose labour sat several full steps below even Nora's position in the household hierarchy we have traced tonight, there existed real pride, real community, real pleasure taken in small things, a good harvest properly celebrated, a wedding in the village marked with whatever modest festivity the family could manage, a particular quality of neighbourliness that survives, in fact, in some of the letters and memoirs of rural labourers from this exact period, describing lives that were genuinely hard by any material measure, and yet were not, in the teller's own accounts, lives experienced primarily as suffering, but as lives, full and complete on their own terms, with their own satisfactions running alongside their own very real hardships. I think this is worth remembering as we finally let this whole evening rest, because it would be too simple and not quite honest to end an evening about extraordinary wealth by suggesting that everyone outside its glittering circle lived lives defined purely by deprivation, just as it would be too simple to suggest that everyone inside that circle, Rosalind included, lived lives free of genuine constraint or genuine cost. The truth, as it so often is, sits somewhere considerably more complicated than either version, wealth and poverty both real, both consequential, both containing, within their very different material circumstances, the same essential human ingredients, love and labour and small private griefs and small private joys, distributed across this whole unequal century in proportions that were genuinely unjust, and that were, within that injustice, still somehow lived through by real people doing their best with whatever particular hand this particular century had happened to deal them. Let us come back, now one final time, to where we began, because I think that is the right way to close an evening like this one. It is very late in the house on Grosvenor Square. The dinner party we sat through together has ended hours ago in the telling of it, though within the world of the story itself, if you remember, it was only just after midnight when Rosalind stood alone in the empty dining room, breathing in the smell of spent candles and melted wax, and the last faint trace of 9 courses of food slowly cooling on the sideboard where the footman had not yet finished clearing it away. She has gone up since then. Nora has unlaced her, brushed out her hair, closed the jewel case, hung the emerald silk on its padded form for tomorrow's inspection. The candles in her bedroom are out now, the fire banked to embers, the window cracked its customary few inches for the fresh night air the health manuals of the era insist upon so firmly. Somewhere below her, the last footman is finally extinguishing the final gas lamp in the hall, and somewhere above her, under the roof, Nora has climbed the narrow uncarpeted stairs to the small shared room where sleep will come to her, exhausted as she is, considerably faster than it comes to her mistress most nights. The leather notebook sits closed now on the writing desk downstairs in the morning room. Tomorrow's page already partially filled in Rosalind's own careful hand. 3 items noted for the morning, a letter to finish, a fitting to confirm, a decision about the seating for next week's dinner that she has been quietly turning over for 2 days now and has still not quite settled. The household ledger sits in the housekeeper's own small sitting room on the ground floor, its pages recording, in numbers precise enough to survive 140 years, and land, eventually, in exactly the kind of careful historical reconstruction we have spent this evening building together, the true cost of a single ordinary dinner, a single elaborate gown, a single servant's entire year of labour, numbers that meant one thing to the woman who wrote them and mean, I hope, something rather larger and more complicated to you. Hearing them now, from this distance, outside, London in 1881 is doing what London always did at this hour, regardless of who slept behind which particular set of curtains. Somewhere not far from Grosvenor Square, in rooms considerably smaller and colder than the ones we have spent tonight inside, other women are also finally lying down after long days of their own, women whose labour in kitchens and workshops and the households of families like the Cambornes made evenings like the one we witnessed together possible at all, though their own evenings ended, almost without exception, in circumstances considerably less gentle than the ones closing around Rosalind now. I think both of these truths deserve to sit together as we close, the genuine warmth and beauty of the world we spent tonight inside, and the genuine cost, borne by people whose own stories rarely survive with anything like the same detail, that made that warmth and that beauty possible in the first place. I think often, when I finish researching an evening like this one, about what eventually happened to worlds exactly like Rosalind's, because I find it genuinely instructive the way a story's ending can sometimes tell you more about its true nature than its middle ever could. The particular grandeur we have spent tonight inside, the 11 servants, the season, the sapphires kept behind a false panel, the whole elaborate architecture of precedence and performance did not simply continue indefinitely into the 20th century unchanged. Death duties introduced in the 1890s began, slowly, to erode the great landed fortunes across successive generations, each inheritance chipping away a little more of what had once seemed permanent. The agricultural depression that worried the Camborne estate managers throughout the 1880s deepened considerably into the 90s and beyond, rental income continuing its slow decline as cheaper imported grain and meat kept flowing in from across the ocean. And then, within a few decades of the November evening we spent inside together, a war arrived that would take a generation of young men like Edward in numbers that made the old order's careful preservation of land and title and lineage suddenly, brutally, almost irrelevant, entire estates losing their heirs in a single afternoon on a battlefield in France or Belgium, households that had trained sons for generations toward exactly the life the Earl himself had inherited, finding, within the span of a few terrible years, that there was sometimes no son left at all to inherit anything. The great houses did not all disappear, certainly, and some families adapted, married new money, sold land, opened their houses eventually to paying visitors in a final strange inversion of the world we spent tonight inside, strangers now walking freely through rooms that had once required a formal introduction and a properly presented calling card simply to enter. But the particular rhythm of life we followed tonight, the 11 indoor servants, the daily toilet lasting the better part of 2 hours, the London season moving in its fixed annual choreography from April to July, that particular world, in its fullest and most confident form, belonged specifically to the decades we spent inside tonight, and did not, in the end, survive very far beyond them. There is something in that worth sitting with gently as we close, not with sadness exactly, though there is some of that too, but with the particular quiet perspective that comes from knowing how a story ends while you are still, in the telling of it, standing somewhere near its beginning. Rosalind, lying in her bed on this ordinary November night in 1881, has no idea that the world she moves through with such complete, unquestioning confidence has in the longer arc of things considerably less time left than it appears to have from where she is currently lying. None of us, in the ordinary nights of our own ordinary lives, ever really do. Sleep itself, I think, is worth one last honest thought before we let this particular night end, because it is, in the end, the one genuine equalizer running underneath everything we have discussed tonight. Rosalind sleeps in linen sheets changed twice weekly by a housemaid whose own sheets, in the small room she shares under the roof, are changed considerably less often, on a mattress considerably thinner, in a room considerably colder once the fire in the family's grates has quietly outcompeted hers for the household's limited coal allowance, and yet sleep itself, the actual falling away of the conscious mind into rest, arrives for both women tonight in essentially the same way it has arrived for every human being across every century of recorded history, a slow loosening of the grip the day has held, a softening at the edges of thought, the particular heaviness that settles into a body finally permitted, after however many hours of labour or performance or careful management, to simply stop. Rosalind's last waking thought tonight, as far as anyone could ever reasonably reconstruct it, is probably not about sapphires or seating plans at all. It is more likely something considerably smaller and more human. Whether Edward's cold seemed better at bedtime, whether the dressmaker will manage the alterations to the Fitzwilliam gown in time, a stray fragment of the Schubert passage she was working through earlier in the week, still turning over quietly somewhere at the back of her mind. This is, I think, one of the genuinely comforting things about looking closely enough at any life, however grand or however constrained, however distant in time or circumstance from our own. Underneath the sapphires and the servants and the 9 courses, there is simply a person, tired at the end of a long day, thinking small ordinary thoughts on her way into sleep, not so very different, in this one particular respect, from you, right now, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight. I want to leave you, before the very end, with a small collection of the numbers we gathered together tonight, not as a lecture, simply as something to hold on to quietly as you drift. Because I think numbers, spoken slowly enough, can be their own kind of lullaby. A dinner for £18.40, a single evening gown, £90, hand-sewn beading across the bodice by a seamstress earning perhaps £1 a week in a crowded workroom above a Bond Street shop, a year of a scullery maid's labour, £8, a year of a lady's maid's considerably more skilled labour, £22, a single pineapple, grown under glass through an English winter, occasionally worth more than a month of a housemaid's wages, a society wedding, gown and breakfast and 6-foot cake and fireworks over the garden, £2,000 in a single afternoon, a household's entire annual running cost, servants and coal and wine and flowers, and the 1,000 small invisible expenses that never quite made it into any single ledger line, £8,000 to £10,000 a year, spent by a family who never once, in any meaningful sense, needed to worry about where the next year's money was coming from. And underneath every single one of those numbers, always a person. The seamstress bent over her needle by gaslight. The scullery maid with her raw, reddened hands still working past midnight. The gamekeeper walking cold Devonshire fields at dawn to ensure the birds were ready for a shooting party he would never be invited to sit down and eat at. Nora climbing the narrow stairs under the roof after 17 hours on her feet, glad, probably, simply to lie down, and Rosalind herself, extraordinarily fortunate and genuinely constrained in equal measure, carrying the whole enormous weight of this particular world, with a competence so complete that almost nobody around her, including for most of her life Rosalind herself, ever quite recognized it as the considerable, exhausting labour it actually was. That is the world, then. Not the postcard, not the portrait smiling faintly from a museum wall. The real one, the full one, silk and sapphires and spent candles, and a sound of whalebone creaking closed each morning and open again each night, £40 for one dinner, and £8 for one whole year of somebody else's life, all of it true at once, all of it sitting quietly underneath the elegant surface that history so often prefers to show us instead. The house on Grosvenor Square is fully dark now. The street outside is quiet, just the occasional distant sound of a hansom cab somewhere on a further street, the faint creak of a gas lamp swinging very slightly in a light November wind. Every window on every floor has gone dark. The nursery, the servants' rooms under the roof, Rosalind's own room at the centre of it all, and if you stood outside on the pavement right now, looking up at that tall white stuccoed front, you would see nothing at all to suggest the enormous, intricate, unequal world that had spent this entire day moving quietly behind those dark windows. I am glad you spent this evening here with me. Wherever you are right now, whatever your own day held, however far it sits from silk gowns and sapphire parures and 9-course dinners, I hope some part of you feels a little lighter than you did an hour or two ago, a little further from wherever your own mind was still turning when we first began. Let the house on Grosvenor Square stay dark and quiet behind us now. Let your own room grow just as quiet. You do not need a leather notebook open on any desk tonight, no items to note for tomorrow, nothing waiting to be decided before you are allowed to rest. Sleep well, friend. We have been somewhere far away tonight, and it is time now, gently, to come all the way home.